Tonight we're stepping back into medieval England. Not the romantic version with noble knights and fairy tale castles you've seen in movies, but the gritty, disease-ridden reality where survival was a daily struggle against impossible odds. You might think you could handle it, but trust me, there's a reason most people didn't live past 30. If you're enjoying these deep dives into history, I'd really appreciate a quick like or even a subscribe. It helps more than you know. I'm always curious where you all are listening from, so drop a comment with your location and what time it is there. Love seeing our little global community connect through these stories. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. We're going to explore why you almost certainly wouldn't survive even a single day in medieval England. Congratulations. You've just woken up in England sometime during the High Middle Ages, let's say around the year 1300. The good news, you're about to experience firsthand one of the most fascinating periods in human history. The bad news, your chances of seeing tomorrow just dropped dramatically, and your modern immune system, soft hands, and complete lack of survival skills have marked you for death in more ways than you can imagine. The first challenge hits you before you even open your eyes fully. The smell. Not the faint mustiness you might expect from an old building, but something far more overwhelming. The stench of unwashed bodies, human waste, rotting straw, wood smoke, and animal droppings all mixing together into a smell so thick you can almost taste it. You see, bathing in medieval England wasn't just rare, it was actually considered dangerous by many. The prevailing medical theory held that water opened the pores, making you vulnerable to disease. Most people went months, sometimes entire winters, without washing their bodies. When they did bathe, it was often a yearly event, maybe twice if they were particularly fastidious. Even the nobility bathed infrequently, preferring to mask odors with perfumes and pomanders when they could afford them. As you force your eyes open, they immediately begin to water and sting. The air inside whatever structure you're in is thick with smoke. There's a fire burning, because there's always a fire burning when possible. It's the only source of heat and the only way to cook food. But chimneys, as we understand them, don't really exist yet in most homes. Smoke just kind of fills the room and eventually finds its way out through gaps in the walls or a hole in the roof, if there is one. Your lungs, accustomed to relatively clean modern air, are already rebelling against this constant exposure to wood smoke. Medieval people suffered chronic respiratory problems throughout their lives, their lungs blackened and damaged from breathing smoke from infancy onward. You try to sit up on what passes for a bed, and immediately several things become apparent. First, you're not alone in this bed. Depending on your social status, you might be sharing sleeping space with family members, servants, or even complete strangers. Privacy as a concept barely exists for most medieval people. Second, you're incredibly itchy. Your modern skin, unused to the inhabitants of medieval bedding, is already under assault. Fleas, lice, bedbugs, and various other parasites have been feasting on you all night. These weren't occasional pests, but constant companions of medieval life. Everyone had them, from the lowest peasant to the king himself. There was no effective way to eliminate them, so people just accepted the constant itching, scratching, and the diseases these parasites carried as normal parts of existence. The bedding itself, if you can call it that, consists of a straw-filled sack that hasn't been changed in months, possibly years. The straw inside has broken down into dust and fragments that work their way through the rough fabric, poking your skin. There might be a thin woolen blanket, scratchy and greasy from the natural lanolin that was never fully removed, assuming your family could afford such a luxury. The wealthy might have feather beds, but even those were infested with mites and other creatures. You realize that every inch of your body aches in ways you've never experienced. The sleeping surface is fundamentally just a slightly softer version of the floor, offering minimal cushioning for your bones and joints. Speaking of the floor, you notice it's not made of wood or stone, but just packed earth. Dirt floors were standard in peasant homes, which represented the vast majority of the population. These floors were often covered with rushes, reeds, or straw that were supposed to be changed regularly but rarely were. Beneath this top layer, you'd find decomposing organic matter, spilled food, animal droppings, and countless generations of vermin. Thomas More, writing in the 16th century about conditions that hadn't changed much from earlier medieval times, described these floor coverings as harboring spittle, vomit, the leakage of dogs and men, the dregs of beer, the remains of fish, and other nameless filthiness. Think about that for a moment. You're living on top of a composting heap of biological waste that never gets properly cleaned, just occasionally covered with fresh rushes. Standing up requires more effort than you'd expect. Your muscles are already stiff and sore from the primitive sleeping arrangements, but there's more to it than that. If you're inhabiting the body of a medieval person rather than just visiting in your modern form, you're likely malnourished to some degree. Even in good years, the medieval diet for common people was nutritionally inadequate. You're probably deficient in various vitamins and minerals, leading to weakness, joint pain, and chronic fatigue that you just have to push through because there's no concept of a sick day or rest for mere tiredness. The structure you're in, assuming you're among the 90% of the population who were peasants, is almost shockingly primitive. These homes were typically one-room affairs, maybe 20 feet by 15 feet if you were lucky. The walls are made of wattle and daub, which is basically woven sticks covered with a mixture of mud, clay, straw, and often animal dung. This technique makes walls that are surprisingly durable, but they're not waterproof, they're not insulated, and they're homes to countless insects that burrow into the dried mud. When it rains heavily, the walls can actually start to dissolve and need constant repair. The roof above your head is thatched, thick bundles of straw or reeds laid in overlapping layers. When new and properly maintained, thatched roofs can keep out most rain. The problem is that proper maintenance requires resources most peasants don't have, so roofs often leak, allowing water to drip onto the inhabitants below. Thatch also provides excellent homes for rats, mice, birds, and insects. The rustling and scratching of creatures living in the roof is a constant nighttime symphony. Even worse, thatch is incredibly flammable. House fires are common and catastrophic, spreading rapidly through tightly packed medieval villages and destroying everything a family owns in minutes. There are no windows in your peasant home, or at best, one small opening that can be shuttered closed. Glass is a luxury far beyond the means of common people. Even oiled parchment or cloth coverings for window openings are expensive. So your choice is between having some light and ventilation while allowing wind, rain, and cold to pour in, or shuttering everything closed and living in smoky darkness. During winter, most families chose darkness over freezing, living for months in dim interiors lit only by the central fire. You notice movement in the shadows, and you realize that you're sharing this small space with more than just other humans. Chickens scratch around in one corner, pecking at the floor rushes. Maybe there's a pig, a family's most valuable possession after their land rights, rooting through garbage in another area. If a family was more prosperous, a cow or ox might be stabled at one end of the room, separated by a low partition if they were lucky. The idea of separating human and animal living spaces is mostly aspirational for the majority of the population. The animals provide some warmth during cold months, which is valued, but they also contribute to the overwhelming smell, the accumulation of waste, and the pest population. As your eyes adjust to the dim light filtering through gaps in the walls and roof, you take inventory of the room's furnishings. There's almost nothing. Maybe a rough wooden table, a bench or two, some hooks on the walls for hanging clothing and tools, and a few clay or wooden vessels for cooking and storing food. That's it. The concept of decorative objects or unnecessary possessions is foreign to people who struggle constantly just to meet basic needs. Everything in the home must serve a function, or it represents wasted resources. You're desperately thirsty, your mouth dry and tasting of smoke. You look around for something to drink and spot a wooden bucket with some liquid in it. This is water, after a fashion. Water quality in medieval England is extraordinarily poor by any modern standard. Most people drink from streams, rivers, ponds, or shallow wells that are contaminated with agricultural runoff, animal waste, and human sewage. The connection between dirty water and disease isn't understood, so no one treats or purifies water before drinking it. You take a sip and immediately regret it. The water tastes muddy, slightly foul, and you can see particles floating in it. You know instinctively that you've probably just infected yourself with any number of waterborne parasites and bacteria. Many medieval people, recognizing at least empirically that water often made them ill, even if they didn't understand why, preferred to drink ale instead. Not the high alcohol content ales we think of today, but a weak ale that was brewed in such a way that the water was boiled, killing at least some pathogens. Even children drank this weak ale from breakfast onward, because it was actually safer than water. Of course, this meant that a significant portion of the population was mildly intoxicated most of the time, but that was preferable to dysentery or cholera. Your stomach growls painfully, reminding you that you haven't eaten in what feels like forever. Breakfast, if there is one, won't be what you're hoping for. For the vast majority of medieval English people, breakfast consists of bread and ale. The bread is dark, coarse, and often adulterated with sawdust, ground peas, or even clay to make the grain stretch further. It's heavy, difficult to digest, and has none of the lightness of modern bread. This isn't artisan whole grain bread, but a dense, often mouldy brick that you gnaw on rather than bite through. Depending on the season and how recently the grain was harvested, the bread might be relatively fresh or months old and going hard as wood. If your family is slightly better off, there might be a thin pottage, a watery soup made by boiling vegetables, grains, and maybe some bones in water. This pot of pottage often sits over the fire continuously, with new ingredients added as they become available and portions taken out for meals. The same pot might be used day after day without being cleaned, just continuously refilled. When meat is available, which isn't often, it goes into this pot. But for most families, meat is a rare luxury reserved for special occasions or religious feast days. The church mandates frequent fast days when eating meat is forbidden anyway, sometimes accounting for more than half the days in a year. The reality of medieval diet is stark and would shock modern people accustomed to varied, abundant food. Common people ate grains, mostly barley, oats, and rye, supplemented with vegetables when available, peas, onions, leeks, and cabbage primarily. Protein came mostly from legumes rather than meat. Fresh fruit was a seasonal treat, available for just a few weeks a year, and considered somewhat suspicious by medical authorities who thought raw fruit could cause disease. The nobility ate better, with access to meat, fish, spices, and refined wheat bread, but even their diets were repetitive and nutritionally incomplete by modern standards. This limited diet meant that medieval people suffered various nutritional deficiencies. Without adequate vitamin C during winter and spring, scurvy was common, causing bleeding gums, tooth loss, and eventually death. Lack of vitamin D from limited sun exposure and poor diet led to rickets in children, causing permanent bone deformities. Anemia from iron deficiency left people weak and pale. These conditions weren't seen as diseases, but just as normal aspects of life that everyone endured. As you chew your bread and try not to think too hard about what might be mixed into it, you become aware of another pressing need. You need to use the toilet. In a medieval peasant household, this presents a challenge because toilets as you understand them don't exist. The best case scenario is a privy, an outdoor pit latrine some distance from the house. This is essentially a hole in the ground, maybe with a wooden structure built over it for minimal privacy and weather protection. You make your way outside to find it, and the experience is memorable for all the wrong reasons. The privy, if your village has constructed one at all, is a simple wooden seat or platform with a hole positioned over a pit that's been dug into the earth. There's no running water, no toilet paper, not even reliable lighting if you need to use it at night. Leaves, straw, or moss serve as toilet paper, assuming you think to bring some with you. The smell is absolutely overwhelming, especially during warm weather when the decomposing waste below produces gases that can actually be toxic in enclosed spaces. People occasionally die from the fumes in poorly ventilated privies, overcome by methane and hydrogen sulfide. The waste pit beneath the privy is supposed to be emptied periodically, a job so unpleasant that it's usually assigned to the lowest members of society, called gong farmers or night soil men. These unfortunate individuals literally shovel human waste out of privies, cesspits, and castle guardrobes, transporting it in barrels to dump outside town or village limits. It's one of the most dangerous and reviled occupations in medieval society. Workers sometimes fall into the cesspits and drown in liquid sewage, or succumb to disease from constant exposure to waste. Many peasant families don't even have a privy, as constructing and maintaining one requires resources they lack. For these people, waste elimination means going to the edge of the village or behind a bush, leaving deposits that accumulate in public spaces. Streets and lanes in medieval villages and towns are contaminated with human and animal waste that's tracked everywhere by foot traffic. The ground is literally foul, and the smell never goes away. In towns and cities, the situation is somehow even worse despite greater resources. Urban dwellers often simply throw their chamber pots out of windows into the streets below, sometimes with a shouted warning, sometimes not. Pedestrians learn to walk carefully and stay aware of windows above. The mounds of waste in streets grow until someone, usually under official pressure, bothers to shovel the worst of it aside or into a nearby river or stream. This practice of using waterways as sewers means that rivers running through medieval cities become toxic channels of filth. Yet people continue to draw drinking water from them because there's no alternative. After dealing with this deeply unpleasant necessity, you return to the house and consider your next challenge, getting dressed. Clothing in medieval England is handmade from start to finish, an extraordinarily labor-intensive process that most modern people cannot begin to appreciate. Someone had to shear the sheep, clean and card the wool, spin it into thread, weave the thread into fabric, and finally cut and sew the fabric into garments. Every step required hours of skilled labor. Because of this, most people own very few articles of clothing. You might have the outfit you're wearing, maybe one change of clothes, and that's it. These garments are never washed in any modern sense because water and soap are precious, and frequent washing wears out the fabric that represents such significant investment of labor and resources. Instead, the outer layers are occasionally brushed or aired out. The smell of unwashed wool and linen, combined with human body odor from people who never bathe, creates a pungent aroma that permeates medieval society. You would grow accustomed to it eventually, but at first, it's nauseating. Men's basic clothing consists of a tunic, basically a long shirt that reaches somewhere between the thighs and knees, worn over a linen undertunic if you can afford one. Brays, a kind of loose linen underwear, are tied around the waist and legs. Wool hose, stockings essentially, cover the legs and are held up by being tied to a belt. Over this, depending on status and weather, might come additional layers, a surcoat, cloak or hood. Shoes, when affordable, are simple leather affairs that wear out quickly and offer minimal protection from cold, wet or rough terrain. Many peasants, especially children, simply go barefoot most of the year despite the risks from cuts, parasites, and cold injuries. Women's clothing follows a similar pattern. A linen undergarment called a chemise worn beneath a woolen gown or dress that reaches to the ankles. Married women cover their hair with various forms of veils or wimples, as exposing female hair is considered immodest and even provocative. Multiple layers are standard, not for fashion, but for warmth, as the buildings you're in provide minimal protection from cold. Wealthy women might have silk undergarments and fine wool gowns dyed in expensive colors, but the vast majority make do with undyed, rough-woven fabrics in shades of brown, grey, and dirty white. All of this clothing is, like everything else, inhabited by lice and fleas. These parasites live in the seams and folds of garments, coming out to feed on human blood. The itching is constant and maddening, but there's no effective way to eliminate the pests. People accept them as part of life, spending idle moments picking lice from each other's hair and clothes in a practice called grooming, crushing the insects between thumbnails. This isn't seen as disgusting, but as normal maintenance, like brushing your teeth would be in a modern context. Getting dressed in medieval clothing is more complicated than modern people expect. The various layers must be put on in the right order, and many garments use ties, laces, and pins rather than buttons, which are expensive and rare. You struggle with unfamiliar fastenings, and your modern hands fumble with the techniques that medieval children would have mastered by age 5. Even once dressed, you're uncomfortable. The clothes are itchy, ill-fitting by modern standards, since they're not tailored to individual measurements, but made in generic sizes, and restrict movement in ways you're not used to. Now clothed and nominally ready to face the day, you step outside into the medieval English morning, and another wave of sensory assault hits you. If you're in a village, which is where most people live, you see a cluster of small, shabby buildings similar to the one you just left, arranged haphazardly around a central common area or green. There are no paved streets, just dirt tracks that are either dusty or muddy depending on recent weather. During and after rains, these paths become quagmires of mud mixed with animal waste and household garbage, sometimes ankle-deep or worse. The village is smaller than you expected, maybe 20 to 50 households depending on the prosperity of the region. Everyone knows everyone else, and privacy is essentially non-existent. Your neighbors know your business, your failures, your successes, and your sins. This tight-knit community can be supportive in times of need, but it's also suffocating, with social control enforced through gossip, public shaming, and ostracism of those who violate community norms. Beyond the clustered buildings, you see the fields where the real work of medieval life takes place. The landscape is divided into large open fields worked cooperatively by the village community. Each peasant family has been assigned scattered strips of land throughout these fields rather than one consolidated plot, a system designed to ensure everyone gets a fair share of good and poor soil. This open field system requires cooperation and synchronization. Everyone must plant similar crops on similar schedules, and no one can fence off their strips or change the rotation pattern individually. The work that awaits you in these fields is brutally difficult by any measure. Medieval agriculture relies on human and animal muscle power with minimal mechanical assistance. Ploughing is done behind oxen or horses if a family is lucky enough to have them, or by human beings pulling the plough themselves if not. The plough itself is a heavy, inefficient wooden device that barely scratches the surface of heavy English soil. Breaking new ground or working clay-heavy earth requires enormous physical effort that would exhaust even a well-fed, fit modern person within hours. For malnourished medieval peasants, it's agony that must be endured anyway, because survival depends on the harvest these fields will yield months from now. If it's spring, you'd be working to prepare fields for planting, a task that must be completed within a narrow window when soil conditions are right. Miss that window, and the entire year's food supply is jeopardized. If it's summer, there's weeding, maintenance, and protection of growing crops from birds, deer, rabbits, and other animals that would eat the precious grain. If it's harvest time in late summer or autumn, the pressure is even more intense. The entire community, men, women, and children working from dawn to dusk to gather crops before weather ruins them. If it's winter, there might be slightly less field work, but you'd be threshing grain, maintaining tools and buildings, cutting and hauling firewood, and performing countless other tasks that agricultural life demands. The work schedule is dictated by daylight, since artificial lighting is minimal and expensive. People rise at dawn or before and work until darkness makes continuing impossible. During summer, this might mean 16-hour workdays. During winter, the days are shorter, but often filled with indoor labor or essential maintenance tasks. The concept of a weekend doesn't exist for peasants. Sunday is supposed to be a day of rest devoted to church, but even then, essential tasks like feeding animals must be completed, and during harvest emergencies, even the church's prohibition on Sunday labor is often ignored out of sheer necessity. This brings us to one of the most oppressive aspects of medieval peasant life, the obligations owed to those above you in the feudal hierarchy. You see, if you're a peasant in medieval England, you don't actually own the land you farm. It belongs to a lord who holds it from a higher lord, who ultimately holds it from the king. In exchange for the right to farm strips in the village fields and perhaps maintain a small garden plot near your house, you owe labor, goods, and obedience to your lord. If you're a villain, as most peasants were, you're legally bound to the land. You cannot leave the manor without permission. You cannot marry without the lord's consent, and often must pay a fee for that permission. When you die, your lord claims your best animal or possession as a death duty called a heriot. Your children inherit your obligations, born into the same unfree status you held. In many practical ways, villains were not much different from slaves, though theoretically they had some legal protections and couldn't be bought and sold separately from the land they worked. Your labor obligations to the lord are extensive and precisely defined by custom. You might owe 2 or 3 days per week working the lord's domain, his personal fields, rather than your own strips. During crucial periods like harvest, this might increase to 6 days per week, leaving you only Sundays to work your own land that produces the food your family needs to survive. Additionally, you owe boon work, extra labor duties at the lord's demand for projects like building maintenance, road repair, or clearing land. Beyond labor, you owe a portion of your crops and animals, perhaps 1 chicken per household at Easter, several dozen eggs throughout the year. A portion of any grain you harvest. The details vary by manor and region, but the principle is universal. The lord takes his share first, and you survive on what remains. In poor harvest years, meeting these obligations might mean your own family goes hungry, but failing to pay what's owed brings harsh penalties, fines you cannot afford, confiscation of property, or physical punishment. And then there's the church, which demands its own tribute. Everyone, regardless of how poor, must pay tithes to support the local parish, theoretically 10% of all you produce, though in practice the amount is negotiated and varies. Grain, livestock, vegetables, eggs, even the labor of your hands, all are subject to tithing. The church is the single largest landowner in medieval England, and its economic demands are as heavy as those of secular lords. Between obligations to your lord and the church, you're working to support a complex hierarchy of people who produce nothing themselves but live off your labor. It's a system that generates understandable resentment, periodically boiling over into peasant revolts that are invariably crushed with extreme violence. The Peasants' Revolt of 1381, though decades after our 1300 setting, illustrates the tensions that simmered throughout the medieval period, with peasants demanding an end to villanage, reduction of obligations, and punishment of corrupt officials. The rebellion was briefly successful before being brutally suppressed, its leaders executed, and conditions for peasants actually worsening in its aftermath. As you contemplate the work ahead, your hands still soft and uncalloused from modern life, you realize that physical labor in medieval conditions isn't just difficult, it's crippling over time. Peasants develop characteristic deformities, spines curved from constant bending, joints swollen with arthritis from repetitive motions, hands twisted from gripping tools, and faces prematurely aged by constant sun exposure. Many are disabled by their 30s, unable to perform hard labor, but with no support systems or safety nets to catch them. They depend on family charity or community arms to survive, living as burdens in societies that have no surplus to spare. Accidents are common and often fatal or permanently disabling. A slip of an axe while cutting wood can sever an artery, leading to death from blood loss within minutes. A fall from a ladder while repairing a roof can break bones that will never heal properly. Being kicked by a horse or ox can shatter ribs or skulls. Without modern medicine, even injuries that seem minor to us, a deep cut, a broken bone, burns from cooking fires, frequently become infected and lead to blood poisoning, gangrene, and death. You watch where you step and move cautiously, knowing that a single mistake could end your life or leave you crippled. The sun is climbing higher now, and you're already exhausted from just a few hours of medieval existence. Your body aches, you're hungry despite the bread you choked down, you're thirsty but afraid to drink more of the questionable water, and you're only beginning to understand the relentless nature of survival in this era. There are no breaks, no safety nets, no modern conveniences to make tasks easier. Everything requires physical effort, knowledge you don't have, and an acceptance of discomfort that goes against every instinct your modern mind possesses. As midday approaches, you think about what comes next and realize with growing dread that every aspect of medieval life that seemed romantic or noble from a distance is actually brutal up close. The castle in the distance isn't a fairy tale fortress, but a military installation built on peasant labor and maintained through violent extraction of wealth from the surrounding countryside. The church you see isn't just a spiritual haven, but an economic power that demands payment for every service, from baptism to burial, enriching itself while preaching poverty to its desperate flock. The social order isn't a harmonious hierarchy of mutual obligations, but a system of exploitation backed by violence, where those at the bottom have no voice, no rights, and no hope of advancement. You're beginning to understand why you wouldn't survive a day in medieval England. It's not just that the physical conditions are harsh, though they are. It's not just that the work is backbreaking, though it is. It's that everything conspires against you. The environment, the social system, the lack of medical knowledge, the contaminated food and water, the constant threat of violence, disease, and starvation. Modern people are soft in ways we don't fully appreciate until confronted with pre-modern conditions. We are physically unprepared, mentally unable to accept the casual cruelties that medieval people took for granted, and completely lacking the skills and knowledge that children learned before they could write their names. The morning has barely passed, and you're already questioning whether you'll see sunset, let alone survive multiple days in this unforgiving world. And this is during a relatively peaceful, stable period. You haven't yet faced war, famine, or plague, the three horsemen that periodically swept through medieval society, killing substantial portions of the population and sending survivors back to even more desperate conditions. As you rest for a brief moment in whatever shade you can find, you notice other aspects of medieval life that your modern mind finds disturbing. Children, some appearing no older than 6 or 7, are working alongside adults in the fields, doing demanding physical labor that would be considered abusive child exploitation today. But childhood, as a protected period of development, doesn't exist here. Children are small adults who must contribute to family survival as soon as they're physically capable. Many are already showing signs of malnutrition and the physical stress of labor, their growth stunted, their expressions showing a weariness that no child should carry. Women work just as hard as men, though their tasks differ somewhat. They're in the fields during crucial periods, but also manage the household, a responsibility that includes food preparation, clothing production, child care, care for sick family members, tending the kitchen garden, managing chickens and pigs, brewing ale, making cheese when milk is available, gathering fuel, hauling water, and countless other tasks that fill every waking hour. Pregnant women continue this work until they literally go into labor, then return to it within days of giving birth because there's no alternative. The physical toll is evident in their worn bodies and faces that look decades older than their actual years. You see an elderly person, probably in their 50s or 60s, though they look 80, struggling to complete simple tasks. They're being cared for grudgingly by family who can barely feed themselves and view the old person as an additional mouth consuming scarce resources. There's no social security, no pension, no retirement homes. You work until you physically cannot, and then you become dependent on family charity, hoping they won't abandon you, which sometimes they do. The elderly who have no family often end up begging or starving, their lives ending in misery and indignity after decades of brutal labor. The social dynamics you observe are rigid and enforced through both formal and informal mechanisms. Everyone knows their place in the hierarchy, and challenging it brings swift punishment. A peasant who shows disrespect to someone of higher status might be physically beaten, fined, or placed in the stocks for public humiliation. Women who speak too freely or challenge male authority are labeled scolds and might be subjected to cucking stools, devices that dunk them repeatedly into ponds or rivers as punishment. Maintaining order depends on everyone accepting their assigned role, and the system uses whatever force is necessary to ensure compliance. As the afternoon sun beats down, you're struck by another realization. Boredom is a luxury you cannot afford. Every moment must be productive. When not doing physical labor, there are tools to maintain, clothes to mend, skills to practice. Entertainment as modern people understand it barely exists. There are no books for most people who can't read anyway. No screens, no music players, no organized sports. The occasional holy day brings festivities, simple games, perhaps music if someone in the village can play an instrument. Storytelling around the fire provides some diversion during long winter evenings. But most of life is work, sleep, and more work in an endless cycle, broken only by Sundays at church and rare festival days. The sun is beginning its descent toward evening, and you've somehow survived most of a day in medieval England, though survival might be too strong a word for what feels like endurance of torture. You're filthy, covered in dirt and sweat, with no prospect of a proper bath. You're hungry again despite having eaten, because the food provides minimal nutrition, and your body is burning energy faster than you can replace it. You're thirsty, but afraid to drink. You hurt in places you didn't know you could hurt. And you're beginning to understand that this isn't a single bad day, but every day, for your entire life, with no hope of it getting better. As you trudge back toward the village as daylight fades, you see smoke rising from the various homesteads, cooking fires being built up to prepare evening meals. The process of preparing dinner is labor-intensive, requiring someone, usually women or older children, to gather fuel, build and maintain the fire, prepare ingredients by grinding grain or chopping vegetables with inefficient tools, and cook simple dishes in clay or iron pots suspended over flames. The results are rarely appetizing by modern standards, usually another serving of bread and pottage, the same meal as breakfast and the meal you'll eat tomorrow, and every day after that with minimal variation unless something is in season or a special occasion permits slight dietary diversity. Sitting around the fire as darkness falls completely, Your medieval family gathered close for warmth. You think about what night means in this era. Without electric lights, darkness is profound in ways modern people cannot experience. A few candles might be lit if your family can afford them, but candles are expensive, made from tallow or beeswax through labor-intensive processes. Most families use them sparingly, if at all, relying on firelight alone. This means that productivity essentially stops at sunset. You can't read, not that you can read anyway. You can't do fine detail work. You sit in dim, flickering light, perhaps telling stories, perhaps praying, perhaps just staring into flames until exhaustion pulls you towards sleep. The night also brings fear. In the darkness beyond your walls, real and imagined threats lurk. Wolves, though increasingly rare in settled areas, still exist in forests and occasionally attack livestock or even people. Thieves and outlaws might prowl, looking for opportunities. But worse than these physical dangers are the supernatural threats that every medieval person believes in absolutely. Demons, evil spirits, fairies who steal children, ghosts of the unquiet dead, witches with malevolent powers. These aren't entertaining stories, but genuine sources of terror in a world without scientific explanation for natural phenomena. When disease strikes, it's attributed to curses or demonic influence. When crops fail, perhaps witchcraft is suspected. When a child dies for no apparent reason, evil spirits might be blamed. This supernatural worldview permeates every aspect of medieval life and makes sense in a world where people have no understanding of bacteria, viruses, weather patterns, or natural laws. They live in a universe controlled by forces beyond human comprehension, where God and the Church offer the only protection against chaos and evil. This gives the Church enormous power over people's lives and minds. Religious observance isn't optional but mandatory, enforced through social pressure and legal requirement. Missing Sunday Mass without good reason brings fines and public criticism. Failing to pay for church services and sacraments can result in excommunication, which in medieval belief means eternal damnation, and in practical terms means social death, since the excommunicated are shunned by their community. As you prepare for sleep, stripping down to your undergarments and lying down on the same flea-infested straw mattress you woke up on, you reflect on the day that felt like a week. You've experienced just a fraction of what medieval life entails, and you're already broken by it. You haven't faced serious illness, injury, or hunger yet. You haven't endured a harsh winter when food runs low and cold becomes a physical enemy that infiltrates every corner of your home. You haven't seen someone you love die from a disease that's easily treatable in modern times, or watched a child starve because the harvest failed. You haven't been called to fight in your Lord's wars, forced to march miles and risk your life in conflicts you don't understand for causes that don't benefit you. The darkness is complete now, silent except for the rustling of animals, the crackle of dying fire, and the sounds of your family settling in for the night. You close your eyes, knowing that tomorrow will bring the same struggles, the same pain, the same relentless effort just to survive another day. And if you're very lucky, very careful, and receive the blessings of a God who seems to favor the nobility over peasants, you might live to 30 or 35 before your worn-out body gives up or disease claims you. This is medieval England, stripped of romance and fantasy, revealed in its brutal, unforgiving reality. A world that would kill you, thoroughly and without malice, simply because you lack everything necessary to survive in it. As sleep finally claims you, your last thought is gratitude that this is only a mental exercise, and you'll wake in your comfortable modern bed with heating, plumbing, abundant food, medical care, and all the countless miracles of contemporary life that we take for granted, but which would seem like heaven itself to the people whose existence you've briefly shared. They endured because they had no choice, surviving day by day in conditions that would break most modern souls within hours. Their story isn't one of glorious nights and noble quests, but of ordinary people grinding out lives of quiet desperation in a world that offered them nothing but hardship from birth to early death. The deeper horrors of medieval medicine. Morning arrives with more aches than yesterday, and as you force yourself to consciousness, you become aware of a new problem. You're sick. Not seriously ill yet, you hope, but definitely not well. Your throat is sore, your head aches, and you feel feverish. In the modern world, this might mean a day off work, some over-the-counter medication, plenty of fluids, and recovery within a few days. In medieval England, this might mean death, and at minimum means suffering through an illness with no effective treatment while continuing to work, because there's no alternative. Medieval medicine is a mixture of ancient theories that bear no relationship to reality, folk remedies that occasionally work through lucky coincidence, religious practices rooted in the belief that disease is divine punishment, and sheer guesswork. The fundamental understanding of how the human body works and what causes disease is completely wrong, meaning that most medical interventions are at best useless and at worst actively harmful, hastening death rather than preventing it. The dominant medical theory of the era is Galenic medicine, based on the ideas of the ancient Greek physician Galen, filtered through Islamic medical texts, and further distorted through centuries of copying and misinterpretation. This system holds that the body contains four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, and that disease results from imbalances among these fluids. Treatment, therefore, focuses on restoring balance through various means, almost none of which actually help. Bloodletting is one of the most common medical treatments, used for an extraordinary range of conditions from fevers to broken bones to mental illness. The theory is that draining excess blood will rebalance the humors and restore health. The reality is that deliberately weakening already sick patients by removing blood, sometimes substantial amounts, often kills them or at minimum delays recovery. Barbers who double as surgeons perform bloodletting using lancets to open veins, or, in a slightly less invasive version, applying leeches that suck blood directly. Either way, you're losing blood your body desperately needs to fight whatever illness you're experiencing. Purging is another standard treatment, administering substances that cause violent vomiting, diarrhea, or both to expel corrupt humors from the body. Strong laxatives, emetics, and substances like mercury are used to provoke these reactions. The result is dehydration and further weakening of the patient, especially dangerous for those already ill. Many people die from the treatment rather than the underlying condition, though of course this outcome is attributed to the will of God or the severity of the illness rather than medical malpractice. For your sore throat and fever, a medical practitioner, assuming one is even available in your area, might recommend a combination of bloodletting to reduce the excess of hot, wet humors supposedly causing fever, and herbal preparations that might include anything from genuinely helpful plants like willow bark, which contains a compound similar to aspirin, to actively toxic substances like henbane or hemlock in doses that could poison you. The practitioner has no real way to diagnose what's actually wrong with you beyond observing symptoms and fitting them into his theoretical framework. Most people never see trained physicians anyway because they're expensive and rare, found primarily in larger towns and serving wealthy clients. For the common person, medical care means consulting wise women, folk healers who pass knowledge down through generations, or relying on religious healing through prayer, pilgrimage to holy relics, or purchasing charms and amulets blessed by the church. Some folk remedies have genuine medicinal properties discovered through trial and error over centuries. Willow bark for pain and fever, honey as an antibacterial for wounds, certain herbs for digestive issues. But these effective treatments are mixed indiscriminately with utterly useless or dangerous ones. Cobwebs applied to wounds, which sometimes helped through lucky coincidence, since some spiders produce proteins with antibacterial properties, but also introduced infections. Poultices of bread mold, which very occasionally helped due to primitive antibiotic properties, but usually just added contamination to injuries. Consuming powdered gems or gold leaf for various ailments, an expensive placebo at best. The germ theory of disease won't be discovered for another 500 years, so no one understands contagion or infection. People observe that disease sometimes spreads from person to person, but they attribute this to bad air, miasmas, or divine punishment rather than microorganisms too small to see. This ignorance means that basic hygiene practices that could prevent disease spread are not practiced. The sick and healthy share living spaces, bedding, and eating utensils. No one washes hands before handling food or after dealing with waste. Wounds are treated with filthy instruments and hands, introducing deadly bacteria directly into the bloodstream. Surgery exists, but is primitive and horrifying by modern standards. It's performed without anesthesia beyond alcohol or opium-based preparations that provide inadequate pain relief, without antiseptics, since the concept of sterilization is unknown, and with instruments that are crude and often contaminated from previous use. Patients are held down or tied to tables as they scream through procedures. The pain is so intense that many die from shock during operations. Those who survive the surgery itself frequently die days later from infections that turn surgical wounds into rotting, suppurating masses of gangrenous tissue. Amputation is a common surgical procedure, used for severely broken limbs, advanced infections, or injuries that won't heal. The surgeon uses a saw to cut through bone, working as quickly as possible to minimize the patient's suffering, then cauterizes the stump with red-hot irons to seal blood vessels. The screaming is supposedly so awful that surgeons often become heavy drinkers to cope with the psychological toll of inflicting such agony. Many patients die from blood loss during the procedure or infection afterward. Those who survive are permanently disabled in a society with no support systems for the handicapped, leaving them dependent on charity or begging. Dentistry is even worse if such a thing is possible. Toothaches are common due to poor dental hygiene, no fluoride, and diets that wear down teeth. The only treatment is extraction, performed by barbers or traveling tooth pullers who use crude pliers to yank diseased teeth from people's heads with no pain relief. The tooth sometimes breaks during extraction, leaving infected fragments in the jaw. Abscesses form, faces swell grotesquely, and blood poisoning sometimes kills patients. Many medieval people lost most or all of their teeth by middle age, making eating difficult and contributing to malnutrition. Childbirth deserves special attention because it represents one of the deadliest events in a medieval woman's life. Maternal mortality is estimated at around 1 to 2% per birth, which might sound low until you remember that women often had 5, 6, 7, or more pregnancies during their fertile years. Over a lifetime of childbearing, the cumulative risk of dying in childbirth is substantial, perhaps 10 to 20% depending on various factors. Women give birth at home, attended by midwives whose knowledge comes from experience and tradition rather than formal training. Some midwives are genuinely skilled at their craft, but even the best can do little when serious complications arise. Breech births where the baby presents feet or buttocks first, placental problems, hemorrhaging, eclampsia, these conditions that modern obstetrics handles routinely are often death sentences in medieval England. If a baby cannot be delivered, and both mother and child are dying, the midwife faces an agonizing choice. Church law dictates that the baby must be baptized, if at all possible to save its soul from limbo. If the mother dies with the baby still inside, the midwife is expected to cut the baby out in a crude caesarean section, not to save its life, which is almost never possible, but to baptize it before it dies. These post-mortem caesareans are performed with whatever cutting tools are available, usually kitchen knives, by women with no surgical training. The results are exactly as horrific as you'd imagine. For babies who do survive birth, their challenges are only beginning. Infant mortality in medieval England is staggeringly high, with perhaps 1 in 3 children dying before their first birthday. Many don't survive their first week. Infections, respiratory illnesses, diarrheal diseases, and simple failure to thrive claim countless infants. Mothers try to protect their babies, but they often don't understand what causes illness or how to prevent it. They swaddle infants tightly, which is sometimes helpful but can also lead to overheating. They feed babies with pre-chewed food, unknowingly transmitting diseases. They use folk remedies that range from harmless to actively dangerous. Childhood itself, for those who survive infancy, is not the protected, innocent phase we recognize today. Children are small adults, expected to contribute to household labor as soon as they're physically capable. A 5-year-old might tend chickens, gather kindling, or watch younger siblings. By 7 or 8, children work in the fields alongside adults during planting and harvest, perform household chores, or begin apprenticeships if they're learning a trade. Education is reserved for the wealthy and the clergy. Most peasant children never learn to read or write, skills they have no use for in their daily lives. Play exists but is limited. Children make toys from whatever materials are available: corn husk dolls, carved wooden figures, balls made from inflated pig bladders. They play games that mimic adult work, pretending to plow fields or keep house. But leisure time is minimal. From dawn to dusk, children work, and the physical demands of agricultural labor stunt their growth and development. Malnutrition leaves many children small and weak for their age. You can see it in the archaeological record, in the bones of medieval children that show growth interruptions, vitamin deficiencies, and signs of repeated illness. The diseases that kill children and adults alike in medieval England are numerous and terrifying. Dysentery, caused by contaminated water and food, produces bloody diarrhea that can dehydrate and kill within days. Typhoid fever, spread through fecal contamination, causes high fever, weakness, and intestinal perforation. Tuberculosis, living in crowded, poorly ventilated homes where people share beds and breathing space, spreads easily, causing a wasting disease that slowly consumes its victims over months or years. Smallpox leaves survivors scarred and sometimes blind. Measles kills the young and weak. Whooping cough suffocates infants. And then there's the plague. Although our setting of 1300 is before the Black Death arrives in 1348, other disease outbreaks still occur. But let's talk about what happens when the plague does arrive, because it's one of the most catastrophic events in English history and illustrates perfectly why medieval life is so precarious. The Black Death reaches England in 1348, probably arriving through rats on ships from continental Europe. It spreads with horrifying speed through a population that has no concept of quarantine, no understanding of disease transmission, and no effective treatments. The symptoms are nightmarish. Bubonic plague causes swellings called buboes in the lymph nodes of the groin, armpit, and neck. These buboes grow to the size of eggs or apples, blacken, and eventually rupture, leaking pus and blood. Victims suffer from high fever, chills, vomiting, and diarrhea. The septicemic form turns fingers, toes, and noses black as tissue dies from blood poisoning. The pneumonic form attacks the lungs, causing victims to cough up blood and die even faster, sometimes within 24 hours of showing symptoms. Medieval physicians try every treatment they know: bloodletting, purging, burning aromatic herbs to cleanse bad air, lancing the buboes and applying poultices of everything from butter to crushed emeralds. Nothing works. People pray, they flagellate themselves in public processions, they blame Jews and other outsiders. leading to horrific massacres. But the plague continues. Between 1348 and 1350, the Black Death kills somewhere between one-third and one-half of England's entire population. In some communities, mortality reaches 70% or higher. Imagine watching half the people you know die within a few months. Entire families are wiped out. Villages are abandoned. Fields go unplanted and unharvested as there aren't enough living to do the work. Bodies pile up faster than they can be buried, so they're dumped into mass grave, sometimes without even basic funeral rites. The social and economic disruption is profound, but that's almost secondary to the sheer human horror of watching people you love die in agony while you can do nothing to help them or protect yourself. The plague returns repeatedly in subsequent decades, never quite as devastating as that first outbreak, but still claiming thousands of lives each time. It becomes a fact of life in medieval England. Any fever or swelling might be the start of plague, meaning almost certain death. This creates a psychological environment of constant fear and uncertainty that's difficult for modern people to comprehend. Death isn't an abstract future event, but an immediate, ever-present possibility. But let's return to your first day in medieval England, before the plague, when death has plenty of other ways to find you. You've managed to eat your bread and pottage, drunk your ale, and now it's time to face the day's labor. If you're a peasant, which statistically you almost certainly are since peasants make up about 90% of the population, your life is defined by agricultural work and the obligations you owe to those above you in the feudal hierarchy. The feudal system is the organizing principle of medieval society, a hierarchy of mutual obligations that in theory provides protection and order, but in practice mostly benefits those at the top while exploiting those at the bottom. At the top is the king, who theoretically owns all the land in England. He grants large estates to nobles, barons, earls, and other lords, in exchange for military service and loyalty. These lords, in turn, grant smaller portions of land to lesser nobles or knights, who owe them military service. At the bottom are you and your fellow peasants, who work the land in exchange for the right to live on it and farm small portions for your own sustenance. If you're a villain, the most common category of peasant, you're legally tied to the land. You cannot leave without your lord's permission. You cannot marry without his consent and payment of a fee. Your children inherit your unfree status. When you die, your lord claims your best animal or most valuable possession as a heriot, a death tax. In many practical ways, your property that comes with the land, though you do have some legal protections that distinguish you from actual slaves. Your obligations to your lord are extensive and precisely defined by manorial custom. You might owe 3 days per week working the lord's domain, his personal farmland, rather than your own strips in the common fields. During busy seasons like planting and harvest, this can increase to 6 days per week, leaving you only Sundays to tend your own crops. You also owe boon work, additional labor whenever the lord demands it for special projects. Repairing roads, maintaining the manor house, clearing forest land, whatever needs doing. Beyond labor, you owe payments in kind. Eggs at Easter, a chicken at Christmas, a portion of your grain harvest, payments for using the Lord's mill to grind your grain or his oven to bake bread. These aren't optional. Failure to meet obligations results in fines levied by the manor court, fines you usually can't afford, leading to confiscation of property or animals or additional labor requirements. The system is designed to extract maximum value from peasant labor while providing just enough resources for survival and reproduction. Then there's the church, which imposes its own demands. Everyone must pay tithes, theoretically 10% of everything you produce, to support the local parish and clergy. More grain, more livestock, more labor. The church owns vast estates throughout England, making it one of the largest landholders in the kingdom. It operates under the same feudal principles as secular lords, extracting wealth from peasant labor while providing spiritual services in return. Of course, many of these spiritual services, baptisms, marriages, funerals, require additional fees beyond the regular tithe. Being born, getting married, and dying all cost money in medieval England. The work itself, agricultural labor in medieval conditions, is brutally difficult. You head out to the fields as the sun rises, because daylight dictates the work schedule. During summer, this might mean 14 or 16-hour days. During winter, shorter days mean less field work, but plenty of indoor tasks remain. The fields are organized in the open field system common across much of medieval England. Large fields are divided into strips, and each peasant family is allocated scattered strips throughout the fields rather than one consolidated plot. This ensures everyone gets some good soil and some poor soil, spreading risk across the community. The scattering of strips means you might walk a considerable distance between your different parcels. You don't have freedom to plant what you want, when you want. The whole village must coordinate, planting the same crops at the same time, following a rotation pattern that leaves some fields fallow each year to recover fertility. This cooperation is necessary because the fields are unfenced and open, with animals grazing on stubble after harvest and on fallow fields. Individual initiative is discouraged because it disrupts the collective system everyone depends on. Ploughing is the first major task in the agricultural cycle, preparing soil for planting. The heavy clay soils common in much of England require a large plough pulled by a team of oxen, usually 8 animals for the heaviest soils. Most peasant families don't own a full plough team, so they pool resources, combining their animals and sharing the work. You might own 2 oxen, your neighbor owns 3, another family has 1, and together you have enough to plough effectively. This interdependence creates tight community bonds, but also means that one family's misfortune affects everyone. The plough itself is a heavy wooden device with an iron share that cuts the soil. Guiding it requires skill and strength as it lurches over uneven ground, catches on rocks and roots, and requires constant attention to maintain a straight furrow. Walking behind the plough all day, hands gripping the handles, breathing dust, muscles screaming from the effort, is exhausting beyond what most modern people can imagine. And this is just the preparation. After ploughing comes harrowing to break up clods, then sowing seed by hand, broadcasting it across the field with practiced throws that aim for even distribution. The grain varieties grown in medieval England are different from modern cultivars. Wheat, barley, oats, and rye are the staples, but the yields are low by modern standards. You might plant 8 bushels of seed and harvest only 24 bushels if the year is good, a 3-to-1 return. Modern agriculture achieves yields 10 or 20 times higher. This low productivity means that most of the harvest goes right back into the ground as seed for next year, with the remainder split between obligations to Lord and Church and what your family can keep for food. Once crops are in the ground, there's weeding, bird scaring, and pest control to occupy the months until harvest. Children often get the job of spending long days in the fields making noise to keep birds away from ripening grain. Rabbits, deer, and wild pigs also threaten crops, and preventing their depredations requires constant vigilance. You can't just fence the fields because the materials and labor required would be prohibitive. And besides, the open field system requires that animals can graze freely on stubble and fallow land. Harvest time, usually August into September for grain crops, is the most intense period of the agricultural year. The entire community turns out, everyone working from dawn to dusk to get crops in before weather ruins them. Grain is cut with sickles or scythes, bound into sheaves, stacked to dry, then hauled to barns for threshing and storage. It's a race against time because rain can rot grain in the fields or mold it in storage, destroying months of work and condemning the community to hunger in the coming year. The pressure is enormous, and harvest accidents are common. Cuts from sharp tools, injuries from falls, overexertion in the heat leading to collapse. If the harvest is poor, whether from bad weather, pest damage, or disease affecting the crops, the consequences are dire. Famine is a recurring feature of medieval life, occurring somewhere in England every few years on average. Regional famines might affect one area while leaving others untouched, but major famine, like the Great Famine of 1315-1317, devastate the entire country. During these crisis years, people eat anything they can find. Bark stripped from trees, grass, roots dug from the ground, animals that would normally never be slaughtered because they're needed for breeding or work. People starve in substantial numbers, their bodies found in ditches and fields, too weak to continue. The social order frays as desperate people steal food, abandon their land to search for relief elsewhere, or simply sit and wait for death. Even in normal years, the period before harvest, sometimes called the hungry time, is difficult for peasant families. Food stores from the previous harvest are running low or exhausted. The new crops aren't ready yet. This late summer gap is when people are most vulnerable to malnutrition and the diseases that exploit weakened bodies. You learn to make food stretch, watering down pottage until it's more liquid than substance, rationing bread carefully, going to bed hungry more often than not. The monotony of the diet creates nutritional deficiencies that manifest in various ways. Scurvy from lack of vitamin C causes bleeding gums, loose teeth, and poor wound healing. Rickets from insufficient vitamin D during long winters leaves children with bowed legs and skeletal deformities. Anemia from too little iron causes weakness and pallor. Night blindness from vitamin, a deficiency makes navigating in dim light even more difficult than it already is. These conditions aren't recognized as nutritional deficiencies, but accepted as normal variations in health. Beyond the field work, there are endless other tasks that agricultural life demands. Threshing grain after harvest, beating the harvested sheaves with flails to separate grain from chaff, is repetitive work that fills many winter days. Winnowing, tossing the threshed grain in the air so wind carries away the lighter chaff while grain falls back down, requires the right weather conditions and considerable skill. Maintaining tools, sharpening blades, repairing handles, fixing harnesses, occupies more time. Cutting and hauling firewood for cooking and heating is a constant need, and forests are becoming increasingly restricted as lords claim them for hunting preserves, making it illegal for peasants to take wood without permission and payment. Women's work parallels men's in its relentlessness. While men focus more on field work, women manage households, which in the medieval context means productive labor rather than modern housekeeping. They brew ale, a several-day process that must be repeated weekly or more often. They make butter and cheese when milk is available, preserving it for later consumption. They tend kitchen gardens that provide vegetables and herbs. They raise chickens for eggs and occasional meat. They spin wool or flax into thread, a task that fills every spare moment, then weave thread into cloth or take it to professional weavers. They sew and repair clothing, an endless task when garments are few and precious. They prepare all meals, which involves grinding grain, hauling water, maintaining the cooking fire, and transforming limited ingredients into something edible. They care for children while doing all of this, strapping infants to their backs or setting toddlers to simple tasks. Pregnant women continue this work until they go into labor, then resume within days of giving birth because there's no alternative. The physical toll is evident in skeletal remains that show signs of osteoporosis, stress fractures, arthritis, and other conditions that plague women who bear multiple children while performing heavy labor on inadequate nutrition. Many women are literally worn out by their 30s. their bodies aged beyond their years by the demands placed on them. As afternoon arrives on your first day in medieval England, you're exhausted in ways you've never experienced. Your muscles ache from unfamiliar labor. Your hands, soft from modern life, are blistered and bleeding from tool handles. Your back screams from bending and lifting. You're hungry despite having eaten because the food provides minimal nutrition and you're burning energy at an unsustainable rate. You're thirsty but reluctant to drink more questionable water or ale. Every part of your body hurts, and you know that this isn't a one-time ordeal, but every single day for the rest of your life. The sun is starting its descent, but there are still hours of work before you can rest. You need to check on your small garden plot near the house, pulling weeds and checking if anything is ready to harvest. The vegetables you manage to grow here, onions, leeks, cabbage, peas, beans, are crucial supplements to your grain-based diet. You also need to feed the pig or chickens sharing your house, gather eggs if the chickens have laid any, and ensure the animals have water. These animals represent significant investment, and losing them to illness or theft would be catastrophic. As evening approaches, the village comes to life in different ways. People return from the fields, moving slowly, bent by the day's labor. You might encounter neighbors and exchange a few words, discussing weather, crops, local news, complaints about the Lord's latest demands. Everyone knows everyone in a medieval village, their business, their problems, their sins. Privacy doesn't exist. Your neighbors know when you and your spouse argue, when you can't meet your obligations, when illness strikes your family. This can be supportive, with communities rallying to help those in need, but it's also oppressive, with gossip and social pressure enforcing conformity to community norms. The manor court meets periodically to adjudicate disputes and punish violations of manorial rules. This court, presided over by the Lord's steward or bailiff, handles everything from property disputes between peasants to punishments for failing to meet labor obligations to moral offenses like adultery or slander. The punishments vary depending on the offense and the status of the offender. Fines are common, paid in money if you have it, or in additional labor or goods if you don't. Public humiliation is another frequent punishment. The stocks, wooden frames that hold your ankles or wrists, lock you in place in the village center where passers-by can mock you, throw garbage at you, or strike you. A day or two in the stocks might not sound terrible, but consider that you're exposed to weather, unable to relieve yourself, unable to protect yourself from abuse, and unable to work, meaning your family suffers from lost labor. For more serious offenses, punishments escalate. Theft might result in mutilation, cutting off a hand or fingers so the thief is permanently marked and disabled. Murder, rape, and other serious crimes can result in hanging, often carried out quickly after trial with the body left on display as a warning to others. Trial by ordeal, though officially discontinued by the church in 1215, still occurs in some areas for some time after. The accused might be required to carry a hot iron, plunge their hand into boiling water, or undergo some other painful test, with the theory being that God will protect the innocent from injury. In practice, everyone gets burned, and whether the wound gets infected determines guilt or innocence. It's justice rooted in superstition rather than evidence. Crime is a genuine concern in medieval England, though perhaps not in the ways popular culture depicts. Highway robbery and banditry exist, particularly in remote areas or during times of social disruption, but most crime is more prosaic. Petty theft, poaching in the Lord's hunting preserves, disputes over boundaries or obligations that escalate to violence, domestic abuse, drunken brawls. Violence is more common than in modern developed societies, partly because alcohol consumption is high, partly because law enforcement is minimal, and partly because disputes that would now be handled through lawsuits or mediation often resort to physical confrontation. Men routinely carry knives as tools, and these weapons come out when tempers flare. Many assaults and murders are impulsive rather than premeditated, fueled by anger and alcohol. Women who commit crimes, or simply violate social norms, face particular punishments designed to shame and control them. A woman accused of being a scold, nagging, or speaking too freely might be subjected to the cucking stool or ducking stool, a chair on the end of a long beam that dunks her repeatedly into a pond or river while villagers watch and jeer. Women suspected of adultery might be paraded through the village, their heads shaved or wearing signs describing their offense. These public shaming rituals serve to enforce patriarchal control and remind women of their subordinate status. As darkness falls completely, you return to your home and prepare for evening meal. This is much like the morning meal, bread and pottage, perhaps with some vegetables from the garden if any are ready. If it's a feast day or Sunday, there might be a small piece of meat or fish, though fish can be problematic in areas far from the sea, as preservation methods are imperfect and you might be eating something that's started to rot. The church mandates frequent fast days when eating meat is forbidden, which for the wealthy means eating more expensive fish, but for peasants often means just eating less, substituting nothing for the meat they rarely had anyway. The cooking fire is the heart of the home, providing warmth as well as heat for preparing food. Keeping it going requires constant attention and a steady supply of fuel. Wood is the primary fuel source, though in some areas where wood is scarce, people burn peat or dried animal dung. The smoke from these fires has no proper chimney in most peasant homes, just a hole in the roof or gaps in the thatch. The interior is perpetually smoky, leaving a layer of soot on every surface, and filling everyone's lungs with particulates that damage them over years of exposure. Eye irritation and respiratory problems are universal. Sitting around the fire after eating, you have a little time before sleep, though darkness limits what you can do. Artificial lighting is minimal and expensive. Candles made from tallow or beeswax provide light, but cost money that most peasants don't have to spare. When candles are used, it's sparingly, for essential tasks only. More common is the rushlight, dried rushes dipped in animal fat that burn briefly with a weak, flickering flame. Most often, people simply rely on firelight, which means that productivity essentially stops at sunset. You can't read, not that most people can read anyway. Fine detail work is impossible. You sit and talk, tell stories, pray, or simply stare into the flames until exhaustion pulls you towards sleep. The stories told around medieval fires are a mixture of familiar Christian narratives, saints' lives, biblical tales, and older folk tales with pre-Christian origins that have been adapted to fit Christian frameworks. These stories serve multiple functions: entertaining, educating, reinforcing moral lessons, and passing cultural knowledge to the next generation. In a largely illiterate society, oral tradition is how history, culture, and values are transmitted. The stories might seem simple or repetitive to modern listeners, but they carry meanings and lessons that everyone in the community understands. Religion permeates every aspect of medieval life in ways that are difficult for modern secular people to fully grasp. The church isn't just a Sunday obligation, but the organizing principle of existence. The calendar is structured around religious festivals and holy days. Saints' days, feast days, fast days, and holy days mark the passage of time more than our modern calendar of months and dates. Your understanding of the world is fundamentally religious. Natural phenomena aren't explained by science, which barely exists in anything approaching a modern form, but by divine will or supernatural forces. Thunder is God's voice. Lightning is divine punishment. Good harvests are God's blessing. Crop failures are punishment for sin. Disease is either divine chastisement or demonic attack. This worldview means that religion offers the only framework for understanding suffering and hardship. When your child dies, when crops fail, when you fall ill, you don't blame random chance or natural causes, but look for spiritual explanations. Perhaps you sinned and God is punishing you. Perhaps someone cursed you through witchcraft. Perhaps the devil is testing you. The church offers rituals and sacraments to protect against these dangers. Baptism to wash away original sin. Confession to cleanse yourself of personal sins. Holy water, blessed salt, prayers to saints who intercede with God on your behalf. These aren't optional superstitions, but essential protections in a hostile spiritual universe. Church attendance is mandatory, not by personal choice, but by law and social custom. Everyone must attend Mass on Sundays and holy days, which occur frequently throughout the year. Missing Mass without good reason brings fines from the manor court and social condemnation from neighbors. The Mass itself is conducted entirely in Latin, which you don't understand. The priest faces away from the congregation toward the altar for most of the service. You can't see what he's doing, can't understand what he's saying, but you're told that something miraculous is happening. The bread and wine are literally transformed into the body and blood of Christ through transubstantiation, a doctrine that you're required to believe even though it makes no sense to your limited understanding. The church building is usually the largest and most impressive structure in the village, built from stone, while peasant homes are built from mud and straw. Inside, the walls are covered with painted images depicting biblical scenes, saints, and terrifying visions of hell, designed to encourage proper behavior and discourage sin. These images serve as teaching tools for illiterate congregations, telling stories through pictures since words are inaccessible to most. The images of hell are particularly vivid, showing demons torturing sinners in creative and horrific ways, bodies burning in flames, sinners frozen in ice, devils with pitchforks and grotesque faces presiding over eternal suffering. These aren't meant to be metaphorical. Medieval Christians believe in a physical hell where souls are literally tortured forever if they die in sin without proper confession and absolution. This creates intense fear and gives the church enormous power. Only the church can provide the sacraments necessary for salvation. Only priests can hear confession and grant absolution. Only the church can perform the funeral rites that ensure a Christian burial, without which your soul might not reach heaven. This monopoly on salvation allows the church to extract payments, demand obedience, and control behavior in ways both subtle and overt. The local priest is supposed to provide spiritual guidance and administer sacraments, but the quality of clergy varies enormously. Some priests are educated, conscientious, and genuinely devoted to serving their flocks. Others are barely literate, can scarcely recite the Latin prayers they're required to perform, and are more interested in collecting fees than providing spiritual care. Many priests keep common law wives despite vows of celibacy, father children, drink heavily, or engage in business ventures that enrich them at parishioners' expense. Yet they still control access to salvation, and challenging them risks excommunication. Excommunication is a terrifying prospect in medieval society. An excommunicated person is cut off from the church and all its sacraments. They cannot attend Mass, receive communion, confess their sins, or be buried in consecrated ground. But worse than these spiritual consequences are the social ones. Excommunicated individuals are shunned by their communities. No one will do business with them, share food with them, or shelter them. They become social outcasts, and in a society built on tight community bonds, this is a form of social death. For most people, risking excommunication is unthinkable, giving the church and its clergy enormous coercive power. As you prepare for sleep on your first night in medieval England, your mind swirls with everything you've experienced. The discomfort, the labor, the constant vigilance required to navigate social hierarchies and obligations, the fear of disease, injury, and divine judgment. You lie down on your straw mattress, pull your thin blanket around you despite knowing it provides minimal warmth, and feel the bites of fleas and bedbugs beginning already. Around you, your family settles in. Your spouse, your children if any survived infancy, perhaps elderly parents if they're still living. The animals shift and make sounds at the other end of the room. The fire dies down to coals, providing a faint glow but little heat. Outside, the night is profoundly dark in ways modern people never experience. No streetlights, no house lights, no glow from nearby cities. Just darkness broken occasionally by moonlight if the sky is clear. This darkness is full of real and imagined threats. Wild animals, though decreasing in number, still exist. Wolves, though rare, are sometimes heard howling in the distance. More commonly, foxes raid chicken coops, rats scurry through thatch, owls hoot ominously. But worse than these natural sounds are the supernatural threats that everyone believes lurk in darkness. Demons who prowl at night seeking souls to claim. Ghosts of the unquiet dead who can't rest. Fairies who steal unbaptized babies or lead travelers astray. These aren't children's stories, but genuine beliefs held by adults who organize their lives around avoiding supernatural dangers. You close your eyes and try to sleep, but rest is elusive. Your body aches from unaccustomed labor. You're cold despite the blanket. The bedding is uncomfortable. Insects bite you persistently. Your stomach, unsatisfied by the meager food, growls with hunger. Your mind races with worries. Did you complete all your obligations? Will the weather hold for the crops? Is that cough developing in your chest the start of serious illness? How will you meet the Lord's demands and the church's tithes and still feed your family? These worries are not temporary stresses, but permanent features of medieval peasant life. Sleep eventually comes, though it's restless and interrupted. You wake multiple times during the night, disturbed by cold, by insects, by the movements and sounds of others in the cramped space, by the need to relieve yourself, by undefined fears that seem more pressing in darkness. This broken sleep is normal for medieval people, who don't experience the long, uninterrupted nights of rest that modern people expect. Instead, they sleep in segments, waking between periods of sleep to tend the fire, check on animals, or simply lie wakeful until exhaustion pulls them under again. Morning arrives too soon, announced by roosters and the gradual lightening of the sky filtering through gaps in walls and roof. You've survived one day and night in medieval England, barely. But this isn't a unique ordeal. It's the beginning of a lifetime of such days, each one bringing the same labor, the same discomfort, the same struggle to meet obligations and secure enough food to live. There's no expectation that life will improve, no concept of progress or advancement for people of your class. This is simply existence, to be endured until death claims you at an age we consider the prime of life. The cycles of medieval life continue regardless of individual suffering. Spring brings planting, summer brings cultivation, autumn brings harvest, winter brings survival. Years blend together, distinguished only by unusual events. The year of the bad harvest. The year Lord William died and his son took over. The year the church roof collapsed. The year half the village died of fever. Your life is measured not in achievements or milestones, but in survival, in children born and hopefully surviving, in obligations met or occasionally failed, in sins confessed and penances performed. As you force yourself up to begin another day identical to the last, you understand finally and completely why you wouldn't survive in medieval England. It's not just that the physical conditions are harsh, though they're almost unbearably so. It's not just that the labor is backbreaking, though it would cripple most modern people within weeks. It's not just that disease and injury lurk around every corner, though they do. It's that the entire structure of medieval life is designed to extract maximum value from human labor while providing minimal resources for survival. It's a system that grinds people down, uses them up, and discards them young. The feudal lords and church authorities who benefit from this system don't see it as cruel or exploitative, but as the natural order ordained by God. Society is hierarchical because God made it so. Peasants labor because that's their function in the divine plan. Suffering builds character and tests faith. Poverty is virtuous, while wealth indicates God's favor on those wise enough to manage resources. These justifications allow those at the top to sleep comfortably, while those at the bottom break their bodies for subsistence wages. Resistance to this system exists, but is dangerous and usually futile. Peasant uprisings occur periodically when grievances become unbearable, but they're invariably crushed with extreme violence. The Peasants' Revolt of 1381, sparked by poll taxes and labor restrictions imposed after the Black Death, reduced the population and made workers scarce, briefly succeeded in capturing London and forcing concessions from the young King Richard II. But once the immediate threat passed, the promises were revoked, the leaders were hunted down and executed, and conditions for peasants actually worsened as authorities cracked down to prevent future unrest. Individual resistance is also dangerous. Refusing to meet labor obligations leads to fines and punishment. Running away means abandoning everything and everyone you know, with no guarantee of finding better conditions elsewhere, and the constant risk of being captured and returned, often with harsh penalties. Complaining too loudly marks you as a troublemaker and invites special attention from authorities. So most people endure, finding what small pleasures they can in community bonds, religious festivals, the occasional good harvest, the survival of children, moments of rest and warmth. The psychology of medieval peasant life is shaped by this constant hardship and powerlessness. Modern concepts like depression or anxiety aren't recognized, but the symptoms are certainly present in people ground down by unrelenting struggle. Alcoholism is common, with cheap ale providing escape from harsh reality. Domestic violence occurs frequently, with men whose lives are controlled by lords and priests exerting what power they have over wives and children. Suicide happens, though it's condemned by the church as a mortal sin that condemns the soul to hell, and suicide victims are denied Christian burial, sometimes being buried at crossroads with stakes through their hearts to prevent their restless spirits from haunting the living. Yet alongside this suffering, community bonds provide some comfort. Medieval villages are tightly knit social units where people have known each other for generations. Families intermarry, creating complex webs of kinship. People gather for church services, for work in the fields, for festivals and celebrations. They help each other during crises, share resources when possible, mourn together when death visits. These social connections aren't optional extras, but essential survival strategies. No family can make it alone. Everyone depends on neighbors for labor sharing, for support during illness or injury, for assistance when obligations exceed capacity. Religious festivals provide breaks from the grinding routine, days when work ceases and communities celebrate. Christmas, Easter, Pentecost, and various saints' days bring feasting, if food is available, along with music, dancing, games, and drinking. These festivals are eagerly anticipated bright spots in otherwise grey existences. They're also carefully managed by church and lord to reinforce social hierarchies. Festivals include rituals that honor the Lord, recognize the church's authority, and remind everyone of their proper place. As your second day in medieval England progresses much like the first, you begin to notice things you missed initially. The complete absence of privacy extends beyond shared sleeping spaces to every aspect of life. You work alongside others in open fields. You attend church with the entire village watching. Your sins are publicly confessed or become community gossip. Your financial troubles are known to everyone. Your children's behavior reflects on your family's reputation. Your body, its smells and sounds and functions, is never truly private in homes where walls are thin, spaces are shared, and people live in constant close proximity. The sensory environment of medieval England is also distinctly different from modern life. The smell, which you noticed first, never really improves. You adjust to it somewhat, but it's always there. Layers of unwashed bodies, animal waste, rotting organic matter, wood smoke, and various other odors mingling into a permanent funk. The sounds are different too. No mechanical hums, no traffic, no sirens. Instead, animal sounds, wind in thatch, crackling fires, human voices, church bells marking the hours for those close enough to hear them. The visual environment is muted, colors mostly earth tones and greys, with occasional bright spots provided by flowers in summer, the vivid paintings in churches, or the rare glimpse of noble clothing in expensive dyed fabrics. Food, which dominates so much of your time and thought, is fundamentally boring by modern standards. The same grains, the same vegetables when available, the same preparation methods day after day, year after year. Spices exist, but are expensive luxuries far beyond peasant means. Salt is precious, used for preserving meat when available, but also subject to taxes that make it costly. Most food is under-seasoned and overcooked, boiled until textures become uniform mush. The lack of dietary variety contributes to malnutrition, but also to psychological monotony. There's nothing to look forward to at mealtime, because you know exactly what you'll get. The pace of life, paradoxically, is both rushed and endless. During crucial agricultural periods, every daylight hour is consumed by urgent labor that cannot wait. Missing the planting window or failing to get harvest in before rain means disaster. But outside these peak times, life proceeds at a rhythm dictated by season and tradition rather than by clocks, which are rare and imprecise. Time is measured in approximate chunks. Morning, midday, afternoon, evening. The bells for church services. The position of the sun. Precision isn't necessary or possible for most people. This creates a relationship with time that's fundamentally different from modern clock-driven schedules. As days blend into weeks, you would begin to notice the seasonal rhythms if you survived long enough. Spring is cautiously hopeful, a time of planting and renewal, but also of dwindling food supplies and hunger before new crops arrive. Summer is work-intensive, with longer days filled with field labor, but at least it's warm and some fresh foods become available. Autumn is frantic harvest time, followed by anxiety about whether enough has been stored to last the winter. Winter is the season of cold, darkness, hunger, and fear. Food stores dwindle. There's less field work, but still plenty of tasks. Illness spreads more easily in crowded, poorly ventilated homes. Death comes more frequently in winter, claiming the old, the young, and the weak. Weather isn't just an inconvenience, but a matter of life and death in medieval England. Too much rain rots crops and makes roads impassable. Drought withers plants and dries up water sources. Hail at the wrong time destroys grain about to be harvested. Late frosts kill fruit blossoms. Early snows trap people and animals unprepared. Medieval people are utterly dependent on weather patterns they don't understand and can't predict with any accuracy. They pray for favorable conditions, perform rituals and processions to encourage divine intervention, and make offerings to saints associated with agriculture, but ultimately they're at nature's mercy. The Great Famine of 1315-1317, caused by years of excessive rain that ruined harvests across northern Europe, shows how quickly medieval society can collapse when weather turns against it. Crops rotted in fields. Grain stores were depleted. Livestock died from lack of fodder or were slaughtered and eaten. Prices for available food skyrocketed beyond what most people could afford. Starvation became widespread. People ate grass, tree bark, and things normally considered inedible. Diseases spread through weakened populations. Crime increased as desperate people stole food. Social order frayed. By the time normal weather returned and agriculture recovered, millions had died across Europe, perhaps 10 to 15% of the total population. These catastrophic events reveal how fragile medieval life really is. The margin between survival and disaster is razor-thin. One bad harvest creates hardship. 2 consecutive bad harvests create crisis. 3 create catastrophe. There are no deep reserves, no emergency services, no government programs to provide relief. Communities and families that have stored extra food might share some with starving neighbors, but their own survival comes first. Charity exists, often organized through monasteries and churches, but it's inadequate to meet need during major crises. Most people simply suffer and hope to survive until conditions improve. Your body, if you survived more than a few days in medieval England, would begin to transform in ways that reflect the environment. Your hands would develop thick calluses from tool work. Your skin would become weathered from constant sun exposure. Your muscles, initially screaming in protest, would adapt to hard labor, though you'd never feel strong in the way modern well-fed people can. You'd grow thinner unless you started already malnourished, as the medieval diet provides calories for survival, but rarely excess. Your teeth would begin to wear down from coarse bread. Your joints would start to ache from repetitive motions. Small injuries would leave scars that accumulate over time. If you were a woman surviving in medieval England, the experience would include additional challenges beyond those faced by men. Monthly menstruation without modern hygiene products means using cloth rags that are rinsed and reused, creating opportunities for infection. Pregnancy and childbirth, which you'd likely experience multiple times if you survive to your fertile years, carry substantial mortality risk with each occurrence. Even if you survive births, the physical toll of repeated pregnancies combined with hard labor and poor nutrition would age your body prematurely. You'd also face restrictions and vulnerabilities that men don't. Your legal rights are minimal. Your husband can beat you with limited legal consequences. You cannot own property independently if married. Your testimony is worth less in legal proceedings. These aren't just theoretical disadvantages, but daily realities shaping your existence. Children in medieval England, as noted earlier, have it particularly hard. Those who survive infancy face a childhood of labor rather than play and education. They're small adults, expected to contribute economically as soon as they're able. Formal education is reserved for the wealthy or those entering religious life. Most children never learn to read or write. They learn practical skills through observation and participation, farming techniques, household crafts, social norms. By their early teens, they're performing adult work. Marriage comes young for girls, sometimes as young as 12 or 13, though consummation might wait a few years, and only slightly later for boys. Childhood as a protected period of development doesn't exist. You're either an infant who needs care, or you're working. The old in medieval England occupy a precarious position. There's no retirement, no social security, no guaranteed support. You work until you physically cannot, and then you depend on family charity, assuming you have family willing to take you in. Adult children have obligations to care for aging parents, enforced by custom and religious teaching. But when resources are scarce, the old become burdens. They eat food that could go to working members of the household. They occupy space. They require care that takes time from productive labor. Most families do care for elderly relatives, but the care is often minimal and grudging. The old who have no family must depend on alms, which are unpredictable, or starve. Medieval England's social hierarchies extend beyond just lords and peasants. Within peasant communities, there are distinctions. Free peasants have more rights and flexibility than villeins. Some peasant families are relatively prosperous, owning more land rights, more animals, better tools. These families form a kind of peasant elite, still far below nobility, but above their poorer neighbors. Other families barely scrape by, owning almost nothing, dependent on wage labor or charity. These class distinctions within peasant society create tensions and competition. with more prosperous families guarding their status and poorer families resenting the better off. Merchants and craftsmen occupy a middle position, neither nobility nor simple peasants. They live in towns, practicing trades like blacksmithing, carpentry, weaving, or trading goods. They're usually better off than rural peasants, with more varied diets, better housing, and access to manufactured goods. But they face their own challenges. Towns are even more disease-ridden than villages due to higher population density and worse sanitation. Town air is famously foul, hence the saying, "Town air makes you free," referring both to the legal freedom towns offered escaped serfs and to the literal foulness of urban air. Guilds control most crafts, restricting who can practice trades and enforcing quality standards, but also limiting competition and opportunity. Nobles and clergy live very differently from common people, though their lives aren't entirely comfortable by modern standards. Nobles have better food, particularly more meat and refined wheat bread. They have larger homes, often stone castles or manor houses, though these are cold, drafty, and not especially comfortable despite being relatively luxurious. They wear better clothing and have access to education and culture, but they face their own pressures. Nobles owe military service to their lords, requiring them to train for and participate in warfare. They're responsible for administering justice and managing estates. Political rivalries and power struggles can be deadly. Many nobles die young in battles, tournaments, or political violence. Clergy range from illiterate village priests, barely distinguishable from peasants, to highly educated bishops and abbots who live like nobility. Monasteries and convents offer alternatives to secular life, attracting some who genuinely feel religious calling, but also many who enter for practical reasons. For younger sons of noble families who won't inherit estates, the church offers career paths. For women who don't want to marry or whose families can't afford dowries, convents provide refuge. Life in religious communities varies widely depending on the wealth and strictness of the institution. Some monasteries are wealthy establishments with fine food, extensive libraries, and comfortable accommodations. Others are austere places of genuine hardship and devotion. The manor house, if your village has one nearby, is where the lord lives when he's in residence. It's substantially larger and more solid than peasant homes, built from timber or stone, with multiple rooms serving different functions. The Great Hall is the center of activity, where the lord conducts business, holds court, and dines with his household and important guests. There are private chambers for the lord and his family, storage rooms, kitchens, and often a chapel. The construction is more substantial than peasant dwellings, with thatched or tiled roofs, glass windows in wealthy households, and proper doors that can be secured. Yet even manor houses are cold, drafty, and uncomfortable by modern standards. Heating comes from fireplaces that warm only the immediate area around them, while smoke escapes up chimneys that don't draw particularly well. Privacy is limited even for nobility, with servants sleeping in halls or in rooms with their masters, and guests sharing chambers. The relationship between lord and peasants is theoretically one of mutual obligation. The lord provides protection, justice, and management. Peasants provide labor, goods, and obedience. In practice, the relationship is deeply unequal, with lords extracting as much as they can while providing as little as necessary. Some lords are relatively benevolent, following customary obligations and not pushing too hard. Others are rapacious, constantly seeking new ways to extract wealth from their peasants. The quality of your lord makes an enormous difference to your daily life. A reasonable lord might excuse obligations during crises, provide seed grain after bad harvests, or settle disputes fairly. A harsh lord might increase demands arbitrarily, ignore customary rights, and use his legal authority to enrich himself at peasants' expense. Lords themselves are part of a hierarchy extending up to the king. They owe obligations to their own lords, creating a complex web of relationships and loyalties that defines medieval political structure. This system works reasonably well when everyone honors their obligations, but it frequently breaks down into conflicts as lords compete for power, resources, and royal favor. These conflicts often involve peasant soldiers conscripted to fight in wars they don't understand for causes that don't benefit them. Being called to military service is dangerous and disruptive. You might march for weeks or months, facing battles, disease, and starvation in military camps. Even if you survive and return home, you've missed crucial agricultural work, potentially dooming your family to hunger. Warfare in medieval England is frequent and destructive. Nobles fight each other over inheritances, territories, and political disagreements. England fights Scotland, Wales, France, creating constant demand for soldiers. These conflicts devastate the areas where they're fought. Armies live off the land, confiscating food, burning villages, destroying crops. Even friendly armies cause enormous damage as they pass through regions, consuming resources and spreading disease. Enemy armies are worse, deliberately destroying anything that might support opponents. Peasants caught in war zones face starvation, violence, and displacement, their homes burned, their animals stolen, their crops trampled. The weapons of medieval warfare reflect both the technology available and the social hierarchies governing who fights and how. Knights are the elite warriors, heavily armored men on horseback, trained from childhood for combat. Their weapons include swords, lances, and maces, expensive items that require years of practice to use effectively. The armor they wear, chain mail and increasingly plate armor, provides substantial protection but is enormously expensive, affordable only by wealthy families. Below knights are men-at-arms, professional soldiers who fight on foot or horseback with various weapons. At the bottom are levied peasants, conscripted for campaigns and given basic weapons, spears, billhooks, bows, whatever is available. These peasant soldiers receive minimal training and suffer disproportionate casualties. Archery becomes increasingly important in English military practice, particularly with the development of the longbow. This weapon, drawn by pulling the string to the ear rather than the chest, generates tremendous power capable of penetrating armor at reasonable distances. But becoming proficient with a longbow requires starting young and practicing regularly, developing the unusual muscle structure and skeletal modifications that archaeologists can identify in remains of medieval archers. Mandatory archery practice is instituted, requiring men to train regularly, but this takes time from agricultural labor and other productive activities. Castles dot the landscape of medieval England, imposing stone structures built to control territory and provide defense. These aren't the romantic fairy tale castles of later imagination, but military installations designed for warfare. Thick walls, narrow windows, defensible gates, towers for observation and firing positions. Inside, conditions are Spartan. Stone walls and floors are cold and damp. Rooms are small and dark. Sanitation is minimal, with guardrobes, toilets that empty through chutes down the outside of walls, creating permanent stains and smells. During sieges, conditions inside castles become desperate as supplies dwindle and disease spreads through crowded garrisons. The castle represents the lord's power and the threat of violence that ultimately enforces the feudal system. Peasants seeing the castle on the horizon are reminded constantly of the military force available to suppress resistance. Lords periodically demonstrate their power through displays of force, punishing those who challenge their authority with public violence that serves as warning to others. This underlying threat of violence is always present, even when not explicitly invoked, shaping behavior and limiting possibilities for resistance. As you continue surviving day by day in medieval England, you become aware of the limited horizons defining most people's lives. The vast majority of peasants never travel more than a few miles from where they were born. They know their village, perhaps a few neighboring villages, maybe the nearest market town, if it's close enough to visit occasionally. The wider world exists only through stories, rumors, and the accounts of the rare travelers who pass through. Geography beyond the immediate area is mysterious. Most people have vague ideas about distant places derived from religious teachings and travelers' tales. They know Jerusalem exists because of crusades and pilgrimage stories. They might have heard of France because of wars, but the actual locations, distances, and characteristics of distant places are unknown and unimportant to daily survival. This limited geographical knowledge extends to limited historical knowledge. Most peasants have a rough sense of recent history, events of their lifetimes or their parents' generation. They know stories of earlier times, increasingly mixing fact and legend as you go further back. But precise dates, sequences of events, and historical context are fuzzy at best. Time is measured more in terms of significant events. The year of the Great Storm, when old Lord Robert died. The time of the murrain that killed the cattle, rather than numerical years. The concept of historical progress or change over time is largely absent. The world has always been like this, and presumably always will be. There's no expectation that future generations will live differently or better than current ones. This static worldview, while limiting, also provides a kind of stability and acceptance. If you don't expect conditions to improve, you're not disappointed when they don't. If hardship is the natural order of things, you endure it without resenting it as much as you might if you believed better was possible. This acceptance is encouraged by religious teaching that emphasizes the transitory nature of earthly life and the importance of eternal salvation over temporal comfort. Suffering in this life purifies the soul and brings you closer to God. Poverty and hardship are spiritually valuable. Wealth and comfort are spiritually dangerous, tempting you to sin and forget God. These teachings help reconcile people to their circumstances while also justifying the wealth and power of nobility and clergy. The church building itself embodies these contradictions. It's built from expensive stone, using skilled labor, decorated with paintings and sometimes sculptures, housing expensive altar furnishings and sacred vessels. The clergy wear fine vestments made from expensive fabrics. This display of wealth is justified as honoring God, making the sacred visible and inspiring devotion in illiterate congregations who need visual aids to understand religious truths. The contrast between the splendor of the church and the poverty of parishioners' homes is stark, yet most people accept it because they've been taught that spiritual wealth matters more than material wealth. Music provides one of the few aesthetic pleasures available to medieval people. The church uses music extensively, with chanted services and hymns that ordinary people learn by ear and can participate in even if they can't read the Latin words. Folk music exists outside church contexts, songs accompanying work, celebrations, and storytelling. Instruments are relatively simple: drums, pipes, stringed instruments like harps or early fiddles, but in skilled hands they produce music that brings joy to hard lives. Dancing occurs at festivals and celebrations, following traditional patterns passed down through generations. These moments of music and movement provide emotional release and community bonding that make survival more bearable. Stories and storytelling serve similar functions, providing entertainment and meaning. In addition to religious narratives, people tell folk tales, legends of King Arthur and his knights, stories of Robin Hood and other outlaws, tales of romance and adventure. These stories often feature protagonists who challenge unjust authority, win against long odds, or achieve justice denied in real life. They provide wish fulfillment and psychological escape. allowing people to imagine alternatives to their constrained existences even if they can't actually change their circumstances. Festivals and holy days break the monotony of labor with celebration, though the nature of celebration reflects the limited resources available. Christmas, when it arrives, brings slightly better food if possible, perhaps some ale, time off from most labor, except essential animal care. Easter marks the end of Lent's fasting restrictions and the arrival of spring with its promise of renewal. May Day celebrations welcome summer with dancing and games. Harvest festivals give thanks for successful crops. Saints' days associated with particular localities or occupations provide additional breaks. These celebrations are eagerly anticipated, but they also emphasize how rare pleasure is in lives dominated by work and hardship. Courtship and marriage follow patterns shaped by economic necessity and social custom. Marriage is primarily an economic arrangement, joining two families and their resources. Romantic love, as a basis for marriage, exists in stories and songs, but is largely irrelevant to actual marriage practices among common people. Parents arrange marriages, considering economic factors, family alliances, and practical compatibility. Young people might have some input, and mutual attraction is desirable if available, but it's not required. Marriage ages vary, but girls often marry in their mid to late teens, while boys marry slightly older, once they've inherited land rights or established themselves in a trade. The marriage ceremony itself is simpler than modern weddings. For most people, marriage involves a public declaration of intent, the exchange of vows, and church blessing, but elaborate ceremonies and expensive celebrations are for the wealthy. Common people might gather at the church door for brief vows, followed by a small celebration with whatever food and drink the families can afford. The focus is on the legal and social recognition of the union rather than romantic ceremony. Once married, couples face the practical challenges of setting up households, acquiring necessary tools and furnishings, and beginning the work of raising the next generation. Pregnancy usually follows quickly after marriage, as there are no reliable contraception methods, and most couples hope for children to help with labor and care for them in old age. Each pregnancy brings its risks, as we discussed earlier, and many women endure multiple pregnancies over their fertile years. The cumulative physical toll is substantial, aging women prematurely and often leaving them worn out by their 30s. Those who survive multiple births and raise children to adulthood are fortunate, having beaten odds that claim many of their peers. Child-rearing practices reflect the harsh realities of medieval life. Infants are swaddled tightly, supposedly to help their limbs grow straight, though the practice also restricts movement in ways that modern parents would find concerning. Babies are breastfed for a year or more if possible, both for nutrition and because there are no safe alternatives to breast milk. This extended breastfeeding provides some natural contraceptive effect, spacing pregnancies slightly. When weaning occurs, children transition to the same diet as adults, bread and pottage, though parents might chew food for young children to make it easier to swallow. This practice spreads diseases, but is seen as necessary care. Discipline of children is strict, reflecting beliefs about original sin and the need to beat wickedness out of children. Physical punishment is standard, with parents, teachers, and employers all authorized to strike children for misbehavior or failure to complete tasks properly. The saying, "spare the rod and spoil the child," reflects common attitudes about child-rearing. Modern concepts of childhood psychology, developmental needs, or emotional damage from harsh treatment don't exist. Children are viewed as small adults who need to be trained into proper behavior, and physical punishment is considered the most effective training method. Despite these harsh conditions, evidence suggests that many parents do feel genuine affection for their children. Wills leave provisions for children. Tomb inscriptions mourn dead infants and children. Chronicles record parental grief when children die. The emotional bonds we recognize as parental love clearly exist, even if they're expressed differently than in modern times. Parents must balance affection with the practical realities of their lives, where sentiment can't prevent the loss of children to disease or starvation, and where surviving children must work rather than be indulged. The elderly, those who survive past 50 or 60, are relatively rare and often valued for their experience and knowledge. In illiterate societies, old people serve as living libraries, remembering events, customs, and techniques from decades past. They know when previous droughts or epidemics occurred, what remedies were tried, what worked, and what didn't. Their memories provide continuity and institutional knowledge that helps communities navigate recurring crises. Of course, old age also brings physical decline, and the elderly who become too infirm to contribute face the precarious existence described earlier, dependent on family care that may be grudging. Death, when it comes, is handled through religious rituals designed to ease the soul's passage to the afterlife. The dying person should ideally confess their sins and receive last rites from a priest, ensuring they die in a state of grace. Family and community members gather to witness the death and pray for the soul. The body is washed, wrapped in a shroud, and buried in the churchyard as quickly as possible, usually within a day or two since there's no embalming. A funeral mass commends the soul to God, though families must pay fees for these services. Those too poor to afford proper funeral rites, or those who died in states of sin, like suicides or excommunicated individuals, are buried in unconsecrated ground outside the churchyard, their souls consigned to uncertain fate. Graves in medieval churchyards are rarely marked with permanent monuments unless the deceased was wealthy or important. Most people are buried in simple graves that are reused after bodies decompose, with bones pushed aside to make room for new burials. This practical approach to burial reflects both limited space and limited resources for maintaining individual grave markers. Death is so common that elaborate mourning rituals or permanent memorials aren't practical for most people. You mourn, you bury. You continue living because there's no alternative. The concept of the afterlife provides some comfort in the face of death's frequency. Heaven promises eternal happiness and the end of earthly suffering for those who die in God's grace. This hope makes present hardship more bearable if you believe better awaits beyond death. Of course, there's also hell for sinners and purgatory, where souls undergo purification before entering heaven. The Church's teachings about what behaviors lead to which destinations give it enormous power over people's lives, as does its claimed ability to reduce purgatorial suffering through prayers, masses, and indulgences purchased from the Church. Miracles and saints play important roles in medieval religious life, providing hope for divine intervention in desperate circumstances. Saints are holy men and women who lived exemplary lives and now reside in heaven, where they can intercede with God on behalf of people who pray to them. Different saints specialize in different problems. Saint Anthony helps find lost items. Saint Apollonia cures toothaches. Saint Margaret assists women in childbirth. Praying to the appropriate saint and making offerings at their shrines might bring miracles, cures for illness, protection from danger, help with crops. Whether miracles actually occur is less important than the hope they provide and the psychological comfort of believing someone in heaven cares about your troubles. Pilgrimages to holy sites, shrines containing relics of saints, or places associated with religious events are popular among those who can afford them. These journeys serve multiple purposes, seeking miraculous cures or spiritual benefits, fulfilling vows made in times of crisis, doing penance for sins, or simply breaking the monotony of daily life. Major pilgrimage sites like Canterbury, where St. Thomas Becket was martyred, or distant locations like Rome or Jerusalem attract pilgrims from across England and beyond. The journey itself is part of the spiritual experience, with hardships endured along the way contributing to the pilgrimage's merit. For the vast majority who never make pilgrimages, local shrines and saints' relics provide closer access to the sacred. Most churches claim to possess some relic, a bone fragment, a piece of clothing, something associated with a saint that gives the location special spiritual power. These relics attract local pilgrims and donations, enriching churches and providing communities with sources of pride and identity. The authenticity of relics is questionable in many cases, with multiple churches claiming to possess the same saint's body parts or pieces of the true cross that collectively would comprise multiple crosses. But authenticity matters less than the faith believers bring to the relics. Superstitions and folk beliefs coexist with official Christianity, creating a complex religious landscape. People believe in fairies, spirits inhabiting natural features like springs or groves, magical properties of certain plants or stones, the evil eye, curses, charms for protection or good fortune. The Church officially opposes these beliefs as pagan remnants or demonic deceptions, but in practice, clergy often accommodate them, Christianizing pagan sites by building churches on them or associating folk practices with Christian saints. This syncretism allows Christianity to spread while incorporating elements of older belief systems that people are reluctant to abandon. Witchcraft accusations occur, but are less common in medieval England than they'll become during the witch-hunting period of the 16th and 17th centuries. People believe that some individuals, usually women, possess supernatural powers that they use for evil purposes, cursing neighbors, causing illness or crop failures, creating impotence or infertility. Suspected witches face social ostracism and sometimes violence from their communities. Official church response to witchcraft is ambivalent, condemning belief in witchcraft as superstition while also acknowledging that demons can work through human agents. Actual prosecutions are relatively rare in the medieval period compared to the hysteria that comes later. Astrology and astronomy are intertwined, with celestial events interpreted as signs of divine will or impending events. Comets, eclipses, unusual planetary alignments all provoke fear and speculation about what disasters they portend. Learned scholars study the movements of heavenly bodies and attempt to predict their influences on earthly events. But even educated people don't clearly distinguish between astronomical observation and astrological interpretation. The idea that the stars and planets influence human affairs is widely accepted across social classes. Medicine, such as it exists, incorporates religious, superstitious, and practical elements. Illness is attributed to various causes: divine punishment for sin, demonic attack, astrological influences, imbalances of bodily humors, bad air, improper diet. Treatments reflect these multiple theories: prayers and offerings to saints, pilgrimage to healing shrines, amulets and charms, bloodletting, purging, and other humoral treatments. Herbal remedies, some effective, many useless, some dangerous. The effectiveness of medieval medicine varies dramatically depending on the specific treatment and condition. Some interventions help through luck or because they contain actually useful compounds. Many do nothing. Some actively harm patients. Hospitals exist, but are very different from modern medical facilities. Medieval hospitals are primarily religious institutions run by monasteries or charitable foundations. They provide shelter, food, and basic care for the sick, poor, pilgrims, orphans, and elderly, but they offer minimal actual medical treatment. Many are essentially hospices, where the incurably ill go to die in relative comfort with religious care for their souls. The medical knowledge of those running hospitals is limited, and the crowded conditions often spread disease rather than curing it. Still, hospitals represent one of the few social safety nets available to people without family support. Leper houses or lazar houses segregate those suffering from leprosy, a disease that terrifies medieval people both for its visible disfigurement of victims and because it's contagious. Lepers are required to live apart from healthy populations, usually in special houses outside towns, and to warn others of their approach with bells or clappers. Their legal rights are severely restricted, and they're essentially socially dead even while physically alive. This harsh treatment reflects both practical concerns about contagion and religious beliefs about leprosy as divine punishment for sin. Returning to your daily experience in medieval England, you realize that the psychological challenges might be as difficult as the physical ones. The constant fear of starvation, disease, violence, divine judgment creates chronic stress that wears on the mind. The lack of control over your circumstances, where weather, Lord's demands, and chance determine your fate, produces feelings of helplessness. The absence of hope for improvement means there's nothing to look forward to except the afterlife. These psychological burdens accumulate over time, grinding down spirits just as physical labor grinds down bodies. Mental illness, though not recognized or treated as such, clearly affects medieval people. Depression manifests in what contemporaries might call melancholy or spiritual despair. Anxiety appears as fearfulness or excessive worry. Psychosis, schizophrenia, and other severe mental illnesses are interpreted as demonic possession or divine punishment, leading to exorcisms or pilgrimages rather than treatment. The stigma attached to unusual behavior causes families to hide mentally ill members when possible, keeping them confined at home rather than risking public shame or accusations of witchcraft. Intellectual life exists almost entirely within the church. Monasteries maintain libraries and scriptorium, where monks copy manuscripts, preserving ancient texts and creating new ones. Cathedral schools educate future clergy in Latin, theology, and church law. Universities begin developing in major cities during the later medieval period, though they're small and accessible only to males pursuing clerical or professional careers. For the vast majority of the population, literacy is unnecessary and unattainable. Knowledge is passed orally through demonstration and practice, rather than through written texts. Technology advances slowly in medieval England, with most innovations coming from outside and spreading gradually. The heavy plough, developed centuries earlier, improves agricultural productivity in heavy soils. The three-field rotation system, replacing earlier two-field rotation, increases yields slightly. Water mills and wind mills for grinding grain and other purposes spread across the landscape, though they're usually owned by lords who charge peasants to use them. These technological changes make some difference, but don't fundamentally transform the grinding poverty and hardship that define most people's lives. Craftsmanship reaches high levels in certain specialized areas. Blacksmiths create tools, weapons, and hardware with considerable skill despite working with simple forges and hand tools. Stonemasons construct elaborate churches and castles, carving intricate decorations and solving complex engineering problems. Manuscript illuminators create beautiful decorated books. Weavers produce fine fabrics. But these skilled craftsmen are relatively few, and their work benefits primarily the wealthy. Most people never own anything made by highly skilled craftsmen, making do instead with crude, locally produced implements and goods. Trade connects England to wider European and even global networks. Wool is England's major export, shipped to Flanders and Italy where it's woven into expensive cloth. Wine comes from France. Spices arrive from the East via Italian merchants. Timber, metals, and other raw materials move between regions. This trade enriches merchants and provides tax revenue to the crown. But it doesn't substantially benefit common people who can't afford imported luxuries and who must produce the wool and other exports through their labor without seeing much reward. Money exists, but isn't always necessary in local economies that often operate through barter and labor exchange. Coins, silver pennies primarily, along with larger denominations for substantial transactions, circulate among those engaged in trade. But many peasants go months without handling actual money, paying their obligations in labor and goods rather than cash. When they do need money, perhaps to pay a fine or fee, acquiring it requires selling surplus crops or animals, which means parting with resources they might need for survival. The money economy is growing throughout the medieval period, gradually replacing older systems of labor and kind payments, but the transition is slow and uneven. Towns represent a different world from rural villages, though perhaps not as different as you'd expect. Urban populations are more diverse, with merchants, craftsmen, labourers, clergy, beggars, and criminals mixing in confined spaces. Markets bring farmers from surrounding areas to sell produce and purchase manufactured goods. Guild halls house the organizations of craftsmen who control their trades. Churches are more numerous and elaborate. Stone buildings replace timber and daub, though many urban homes are still wooden structures vulnerable to fire. Streets are narrow, often barely wide enough for two people to pass, hemmed in by buildings that lean toward each other across the gaps. Sanitation is even worse than in villages, with higher population density overwhelming primitive waste disposal methods. Urban diseases spread rapidly through crowded populations living in filth. Typhoid, cholera, dysentery, and various fevers run through towns regularly, killing substantial numbers before burning out for lack of susceptible hosts. The Black Death hits towns particularly hard, with mortality sometimes exceeding 50% in urban areas compared to the already horrific 30–40% in the countryside. Yet towns continue to attract migrants from rural areas because they offer opportunities unavailable in villages. Learning a craft, engaging in trade, escaping serfdom. Town air makes you free after a year and a day of residence in many places. These possibilities draw people despite the dangers. Urban poverty can be even more desperate than rural poverty. In villages, at least you have access to land, however limited, and community support networks built over generations. In towns, the poor might have nothing except their labor, which they sell for whatever wages they can get. When work isn't available or they're too sick or injured to labor, they beg or starve. Charitable institutions provide some relief, but it's inadequate to meet need. The visible presence of beggars, cripples, and starving people in urban streets creates moral pressure on those with resources to give alms, but also breeds resentment and fear of the desperate poor. Crime is more prevalent in towns than in villages, driven by poverty, opportunity, and the relative anonymity urban environments provide. Cutpurses steal from crowds in markets. Burglars break into homes and shops. Prostitutes solicit in streets and taverns. Gangs of youths commit assaults and robberies. Urban authorities attempt to maintain order through watch systems where citizens take turns patrolling at night. But these amateur law enforcement efforts are often ineffective against determined criminals. Punishments for caught criminals are harsh: public whippings, time in stocks or pillories, mutilation, or hanging, but the deterrent effect is limited. Prostitution exists in a grey area, officially condemned by church and law, but tolerated in practice as a necessary evil. Brothels operate openly in some towns, sometimes even licensed and regulated by authorities who prefer controlling the trade to eliminating it. Prostitutes themselves are usually desperately poor women with few alternatives: widows, abandoned wives, women who lost positions as servants or craftswomen. They face violence from clients, exploitation by pimps and brothel keepers, disease, and social stigma. Religious authorities periodically launch campaigns to reform prostitutes, offering them places in convents or other institutions, but these efforts have limited success. Taverns and alehouses are social centers in both towns and villages, places where men gather to drink, gamble, socialize, and conduct business. The ale served is weak and consumed in quantity, leading to widespread drunkenness and the violence that often accompanies it. Fights break out over trivial insults or disputes, sometimes escalating to serious injuries or deaths. Church authorities condemn excessive drinking and the sins associated with taverns, but alehouse culture persists because it provides one of the few recreational outlets available to common men. Women's access to public drinking spaces is more restricted, though they're not entirely excluded. Respectable women typically drink at home rather than in taverns. Women who frequent alehouses risk their reputations and may be assumed to be prostitutes whether they are or not. Brewing ale is women's work in most households, and some women brew commercially, selling ale from their homes and becoming alehouses. These alewives occupy a precarious social position, engaged in trade that's economically valuable but morally questionable by the standards of the time. Games and entertainment exist, but are simpler than modern leisure activities. Dice games and primitive card games, when cards become available in the later medieval period, provide gambling opportunities. Wrestling, bare-knuckle fighting, and other physical contests pit men against each other for honor and wages. Animal blood sports, bear baiting, cockfighting attract crowds who bet on outcomes. Football, a very different game from modern versions, involves large groups of men from different villages trying to move a ball to designated goals, with few rules and frequent injuries. These rough entertainments reflect the violence that permeates medieval culture. Seasonal celebrations incorporate elements that seem bizarre or shocking to modern sensibilities. Charivari, or rough music, involves mocking public humiliation of people who violate social norms, men dominated by their wives, women who remarry too quickly after widowhood, mismatched couples. Crowds gather outside the offenders' homes, banging pots, shouting insults, sometimes physically assaulting the targets. This communal enforcement of social norms through ritualized shaming keeps people in line more effectively than formal laws in many cases. Carnival celebrations before Lent allow temporary suspension of normal rules, with role reversals, mockery of authorities, and excessive eating and drinking before the fast begins. These periods of permitted chaos serve as safety valves, allowing populations to express frustrations and challenge hierarchies in controlled contexts that don't actually threaten the social order. Once carnival ends, normal hierarchies reassert themselves and everyone returns to their proper places. The rhythm of the liturgical calendar structures time more than the secular calendar for most people. The church year begins with Advent, a penitential season preparing for Christmas. Christmas itself celebrates Christ's birth with feasting and celebration. Epiphany follows 12 days later. Lent brings 40 days of fasting and penance before Easter, the most important holy day celebrating Christ's resurrection. Pentecost comes 50 days after Easter. Numerous saints' days throughout the year provide additional holy days, some requiring church attendance, some permitting rest from labor, some allowing fairs and markets. This religious calendar gives shape and meaning to the passage of time in ways that secular dates cannot. After weeks or months in medieval England, assuming you somehow survived that long, you'd have developed a routine and perhaps even adapted to some extent. Your body would have toughened, calluses forming on hands, muscles adapting to constant labor, digestive system adjusting somewhat to the limited diet. Your mind would have learned to accept conditions that initially seemed unbearable, finding small pleasures in community interactions, seasonal celebrations, moments of rest. You'd have internalized the social hierarchies and religious worldview that structure medieval life, thinking in terms of your ordained place in God's creation rather than modern concepts of rights or equality. But adaptation doesn't mean thriving or even comfort. It means survival in circumstances that remain fundamentally harsh. The hunger never fully goes away. The cold returns each winter. Disease continues threatening. Work never ceases. And death waits patiently, knowing that few people make it past 40 and most die much younger. The statistical likelihood of you surviving even 1 year in medieval England is not particularly high if you arrived with a modern immune system unexposed to the diseases constantly circulating, with soft hands unprepared for agricultural labor, with expectations of nutrition and comfort that cannot be met. Let's say you somehow beat the odds and survived a full year. You'd have witnessed the complete agricultural cycle, from spring planting through summer growth to autumn harvest and winter survival. You'd have participated in the major religious festivals. You'd have learned the customs and expectations of your community. You'd have developed relationships with neighbors and perhaps family members if you were placed into a family structure. You'd have a sense of the rhythms and patterns that define medieval existence. But you'd also have experienced losses. Perhaps a neighbor died of fever. Maybe a child in your household didn't survive. Possibly an animal you depended on was lost to disease or accident. You'd have gone hungry during the lean times before harvest. You'd have been cold beyond anything you thought possible during winter months. You'd have worked until your body screamed in protest, then continued working because there was no alternative. You'd have witnessed violence, injustice, and suffering that you were powerless to prevent or address. Looking toward a potential second year, you know exactly what awaits. The same labor, the same deprivation, the same fears. No progress, no improvement, no hope for change. Just endurance, day after day, until death finally releases you from the struggle. This is the existential reality of medieval peasant life. Not adventure or romance or noble quests, but grinding poverty and endless toil in service to systems that exploit you while offering minimal survival in return. The structures of power, feudal hierarchy, church authority, legal systems, all exist to maintain this exploitation. They're justified through ideology that presents the current order as divinely ordained and natural. Kings rule by God's grace. Nobles are born to their position through God's will. Peasants labor because that's their function in God's plan. Challenging this order is not just political rebellion, but sin against God's design. This ideological framework makes resistance difficult not just practically, but psychologically, as rebels must fight against their own internalized beliefs about proper social organization. Yet resistance does occur, proving that even comprehensive ideological control can't entirely suppress human desire for justice and better conditions. Peasants revolt when pressures become unbearable. Workers demand better wages. Communities resist lords' attempts to increase obligations beyond customary levels. These resistances usually fail, crushed by superior force and followed by retaliation that worsens conditions. But they keep happening because the alternative, complete acceptance of exploitation without protest, proves impossible for humans to maintain indefinitely. The medieval period itself is not static despite the impression of changeless hierarchy. Over the centuries, changes do occur. Technology improves slightly. Towns grow. Trade expands. Legal systems develop more complexity. Population rises and falls in response to disease and climate. The Black Death in particular forces massive changes as labor scarcity gives surviving workers more leverage to demand better conditions. But these changes happen slowly, over generations, invisible to individuals living through them. From any single person's perspective, the world is stable and unchanging, as it has always been and always will be. As your first day in medieval England concludes, as darkness falls, and you prepare once again for uncomfortable sleep on your straw mattress, you understand finally and completely why you wouldn't survive a day in this world. It's not just about lacking practical skills, though that would kill you quickly enough. It's not just about your modern immune system's vulnerability to medieval diseases, though that would also likely prove fatal. It's about the totality of medieval existence, the combination of physical hardship, social oppression, psychological stress, limited resources, and constant threats that create conditions almost no modern person could endure. We live in extraordinary comfort compared to our medieval ancestors. Clean water flows from taps. Food is abundant and varied. Shelter protects us from weather. Medicine treats diseases and injuries that would have been fatal centuries ago. We work fewer hours under safer conditions. We have rights, opportunities, and freedoms that peasants couldn't imagine. We live decades longer on average. Our children usually survive infancy. We are literate, educated, connected to global networks of information and culture. None of this is to say modern life is perfect. We face our own challenges, stresses, and injustices, but compared to medieval England, we live in unimaginable luxury. Understanding this helps appreciate what we have while also recognizing how fragile progress is. The conditions that made medieval life so brutal, poverty, disease, exploitation, ignorance, didn't vanish on their own, but were slowly overcome through human effort, technological advancement, social change, and political struggle. Maintaining and extending these improvements requires continued effort, as history shows how quickly progress can reverse when societies collapse or choose to abandon advances. So as you lie in your uncomfortable medieval bed, waiting for sleep that will bring temporary escape from grinding reality, you think about the modern world you left behind. Its problems seem trivial compared to the immediate life and death struggles of medieval existence. Its comforts seem miraculous, technologies indistinguishable from magic to medieval minds. Its opportunities seem limitless compared to the rigid constraints of feudal society. And you understand, viscerally and completely, why you wouldn't survive a day in medieval England. Because you're soft in ways medieval people couldn't afford to be, because you expect things they never dreamed of, because you've been shaped by a world so different that you'd be fundamentally unable to function in theirs. The darkness deepens. The sounds of night settle around you, and you wait for dawn that will bring another day identical to this one, another test of survival, another grinding challenge to endure. This is medieval England, stripped of fantasy and romance, revealed in all its harsh, unforgiving reality. A world that would break you, not through malice, but through simple indifference to your suffering. A world where survival was itself an achievement, and where most people's lives were, in Thomas Hobbes' later famous phrase, nasty, brutish, and short. If you made it through this deep dive into medieval history, I really appreciate you hanging in there with me. These long explorations of how hard life used to be really put modern existence in perspective, don't they? If you enjoyed this journey back to medieval England, please consider leaving a like or subscribing to the channel. It genuinely helps me create more of this content, and I'd love to know where you're listening from and what time it is there. Drop a comment below. There's something special about knowing this little community of night owls and history lovers is spread across the globe, all learning together as we drift off to sleep. Sweet dreams, everyone. Until next time.